What if an ordinary student simply took possession of Excalibur, the legendary strongest sword of all, capable of cutting through anything with a single strike? But obviously, this piece of shit loser isn't ready for that yet. He's all malnourished and weak. So hold your horses. Imagine if you could enter the manhwa you're reading and live inside it. You just have to be careful not to end up in a manhwa that's too f***ing hard. Our loser protagonist was reading one where, at the end, there was a duel between the rank 1 and rank 2 swordsmen. After a short battle between them, Nagi activates a broken-ass OP skill and cuts off the arm of Dean, the rank 2 swordsman. That wasn't the result he expected. Sometimes ranked players are using hacks too, and we don't even know it. So, with a lot of hate in his heart, he went to talk trash in the comments, saying that if this becomes the best comment, he will f*** up that girl using combusting blade. The problem is that this trash kid has always been lonely at school. He always avoided the popular kids. That's because whenever he tried to make contact, he was either ignored or treated coldly like the piece of garbage he was. But on that day, the blonde kid defended him, in a way. Meanwhile, the likes on his comment were slowly rising. The boy remained lonely, ignored by everyone. Now, in the bathroom, he was furious with everything. Suddenly, he hears the voices of some students. The boys ask the blonde kid why the hell he defended that idiot and if they are friends or something, but he just says the protagonist is pathetic. That completely breaks the kid's spirit. After everyone leaves the bathroom, the blonde guy says that he only knows how to run away and that he's pathetic. In other words, the guy knew he was in there the whole time. Everything was over. Meanwhile, the likes wouldn't stop climbing. As he wallowed in self-pity, saying he wanted to become the protagonist of the story, the likes exploded. God watched that pathetic scene and smirked. With a bolt of lightning falling from the sky directly where Seol Jinhyo was, he was teleported somewhere else. He was teleported directly in front of Nagi, the strongest swordswoman. Now I'm absolutely f***ed. Nagi asks, "What are you doing?"
Me? Just hanging around.
Inside, there was a somewhat familiar person facing Nagi. Seol Jinhyo had crossed the girl's absolute realm as if it were nothing. Then the announcer begins to inform that an extraordinary event had occurred with that unidentified man entering the fight out of nowhere, and he was definitely inside Nagi's absolute realm. The blonde, for his part, was watching all of this from the ground, thinking it was completely impossible. After all, even he, who was in second place, hadn't managed to do that. That guy who was there was truly not an ordinary person. He had done one of the most impossible things in the world in a second. Seol, for his part, seemed not to understand very well what was happening there. His panicked face showed tremendous despair. He looked around the stadium, quite lost, wondering what had happened. A second ago, he had been sitting on the toilet in the bathroom, reading the webtoon peacefully. Noticing the presence of someone there, Seol realized that place was somewhat familiar. He remembered that girl with white hair very well. He had seen her on his phone when he was calmly reading the work, Player. As Nagi asked him to identify himself, Seol realized this was the same scene he had read in the webtoon that morning. Moreover, some things were becoming clearer in his memory. That girl was probably a character from the work Player. Upon realizing what that meant, Seol let out a slight chuckle. He then began to provoke his opponent, thinking it was all just a simple dream. While the girl told him not to move, Seol commented on how stressful that day had been due to work and how being there would be nice. Nagi's class was that of a swordsman and was somewhat basic. While Seol teased the girl, the blonde boy watched all of this, dumbfounded, unable to believe the audacity of that guy. All of Nagi's strength was based on her basic training, which led her to develop highly complex skills to execute. Dean, lying on the ground, quite worn out, showed concern about how close that guy was to the enemy. Nagi, for her part, was already threatening the boy, trying to prevent his movement. Her training had resulted in an incredible refinement of a sensational skill, better known as Absolute Realm. So, right after being disobeyed, Nagi decided to put that simple human in his place. The spectators, noticing that the atmosphere had turned cold for the boy, displayed tense expressions. Dean, for his part, was impressed by the amount of power Nagi still had left, seeming to have no limits in her abilities. That immense antipathy was indeed the true absolute realm of hers. Seol would probably go straight to the ground because it would be impossible to stand in the space the girl occupied. Staying alive in the face of such murderous intent would be the biggest challenge for that kid. Dean was then impressed to see that the boy was still doing well amidst all that chaos. Seol, for his part, even joked, saying that the absolute realm was just an extremely comfortable breeze to be in. Nagi, hearing that, began to consider it a warning that her enemy would not back down under any circumstances. And in that way, she decided to accept the boy's challenge. Without thinking twice, Nagi called the kid for a direct fight. Dean quickly realized that the girl was holding back and had drawn her sword to defeat Seol. The blonde kept wondering how strong that mysterious boy, scared of a sword, really was. After drawing her sword, Nagi pointed it directly at Seol, who was left speechless. He was trembling with fear because not even in a dream would he be able to face such a sharp weapon. But suddenly, Seol pulls a lot of determination from within his spirit that prevents him from fleeing the fight. He could not live his life running away from everything, even in his own dreams. Nagi, upon hearing the boy's trembling words, simply stares at him without any reaction. Since everything was just a dream to him, Seal questions her about her physical appearance. Nagi does not answer the boy, and he confidently repeats the question, sure that he would win the battle. Seal then takes his first step forward towards the enemy with the intention of attacking her. He was going to throw a simple punch at that girl who seemed utterly unbeatable. What Seal was experiencing was not merely a dream, and his useless attack was a thoughtless move. But there was a reason behind that clumsy strike from the protagonist, and the whole truth was hidden behind Nagi's sword, which was definitely not moving in any direction at that moment. Since there was no murderous intent there, Seal ended up thinking that Nagi would not kill him. To him, she just wanted to scare him a little to show how far apart they were in terms of power. However, there was something in all of this that Seal had no idea about. It was that the moment she wielded the sword, something had already been decided. Nagi had certainly just determined the slicing of her opponent into several pieces. With that, without thinking twice, she delivers a precise blow to the boy's body without any mercy. This generates an enormous impact similar to that of a bomb after hitting the ground. From above the stadium, the spectators were stunned, wondering what had happened there. Nagi, for her part, drew the attention of the fight's narrator for the final verdict of the battle. She wanted him to announce the results as quickly as possible. Then the guy highlights that the boy was clearly unable to continue fighting, and that victory, as expected, was claimed by the girl with white hair. The creator of that webtoon, upon realizing that Seal had lost, did not accept such a dull ending. It hadn't even stirred his heart, being completely different from the comment made by Seal. In light of these facts, the guy decides that it couldn't end like this and lets out a slight evil laugh. By clicking on his cell phone, he begins to literally mess with the protagonist's head. Seal seemed to be falling into an endless abyss like that of a black hole. His expression was completely worn out, and he kept questioning whether he had already died. He thought that everything around him was the end of his life. Suddenly, Seal begins to see a huge light high up in the place. His somewhat blurred vision starts to perceive some remnants of the world. There, by his side, was a blonde girl looking quite worried about his physical state. She kept asking Seal to wake up as quickly as possible. Finally, the protagonist manages to fully open his eye, looking quite scared by everything around him. That girl is a bit surprised to see that weak boy wake up after such a sinister blow. It was impossible to clearly know the level and rank of that character who called Seal stupid. He seemed very scared and nervous observing this presence. Finally, Seal breaks his silence and asks the guy where he was at that moment. But suddenly, he is grabbed by the neck in a very rough manner. The girl was going to forgive him for staring at her without permission, but ended up retracting that decision. To her, Seal asking such a question was a kind of bold provocation, as if he wanted to fight her. Based on that, she tightens the boy's neck even more with all her strength. He had crossed the line, and for that, he would be punished severely. She was so angry that she would literally make the boy disappear from there. But suddenly, someone arrives at the scene and orders the cessation of that torture. Immediately, the girl obeys that order without thinking twice. When released, Seal falls to the ground and feels quite relieved, able to breathe normally again. The commander apologizes to the boy because that girl had been born not long ago. After that, he introduces himself and tells the protagonist his mysterious name. That mystery quickly falls apart in a few seconds as he reveals that his name was Arthur, and he was the king of that world with a rank so high that it could not be counted. While Arthur was having this conversation with the visitor, the girl was begging to be released, placing all the blame on the boy. Upon hearing these pleas, the king simply asks her to quiet down because she had ruined his mood. After that, he begins to carefully analyze that intruder from his world. The same was trying to figure out what was wrong there, while Seal seemed very scared by the presence of a true god. Seeing Arthur approach, planting his sword in the ground, Seal becomes even tenser, begging for his life and for the forgiveness of the owner of that world. Witnessing all the commotion caused by the boy, the king decides to explain better the situation he was in. Then Arthur kindly asks Seal Jinheo to pay close attention to his words. After that, the king extends his hand towards the fallen boy, and reveals that he decided to take him in after thinking for a while. However, Seal would become an official player of that game, and he didn't seem to like that idea very much. Upon hearing that he would be a character in that game, the boy becomes a bit confused. To him, all of that was supposed to be the title of a webtoon, and that's why the king realizes the boy hadn't read carefully. At that moment, Seal becomes even more confused, knowing he missed some very important information. He still felt a lot of pain in his neck due to the attack made by that crazy girl. But Arthur seems to not care about that and decides to proceed with all his plans. He then decides to show the boy his entire world, and with a snap of his fingers, everything seems to disappear to make way for the presentation of that place. The Celestial Arena, better known as Terrarium, was filled with gold and endless treasures, with many hopes and dreams for those who arrived there. And those who ascended it had a specific name. They were the incredible players with extraordinary abilities. Upon hearing about the players, Seal displays a somewhat tense expression, thinking he would be one of them. Arthur then confirms this information, as that was the new position of that simple boy. Soon he points to a blonde boy who was there, and also to a little girl with white hair who was also present. Then finally, he arrives at the protagonist, who was utterly shocked. In a rather trembling manner, he tries to ask a question to the owner of the place. Seal then questions if he would really become a player like those characters, and he is positively answered by Arthur, who found it incredible. The boy, despite all this clarifying conversation, did not understand the reason for all of it. He wanted to know why he had been chosen for this position so suddenly. Upon hearing this question, Arthur doesn't quite understand and makes a silly face. Again, Seal asks why he had to become a player and compete with those characters who were almost monsters. Moreover, there was a limit to how absurd someone could be, and Arthur couldn't decide in that way what the boy would or wouldn't do. Upon hearing these somewhat defiant justifications from the protagonist, the king seems to not understand very well. So he responds to the boy that all of that was because of his comment, making him quite tense. That post said that if he were the best, Seal himself would wipe the floor with the face of that girl who wielded the combustion sword. This threat from Seal could only be fulfilled if he became a player, according to the king, since Nagi was in the celestial arena terrarium. Realizing he got himself into trouble because of a simple comment, the boy displays a desolate expression. To him, that was nothing more than a miserable post of no importance. But according to Arthur, he should have thought about writing a better comment without threatening anyone. This truth spoken by the king leaves the boy quite sad and almost in tears. But suddenly, Arthur starts laughing a lot and informs that he was just joking with Seal. He certainly wouldn't force the boy to do that. Based on this, Seal would indeed have the option to give up everything. But Arthur didn't know that the boy wanted so much to return to reality. Upon hearing these words from the king, Seal becomes a bit thoughtful about it. This reality was a place full of people who did nothing but belittle him whenever they had the chance. And this makes Seal think deeply about whether to return to the normal world or not. Then, without wasting any time, Arthur questions the boy about his final decision. At that moment, Seal's mind became calm as he had the opportunity not to live in a horrible place like the real world. So he decides to ask Arthur Nim a question. He wanted to know what he would gain if he defeated the first place in the game. Upon hearing this question, the god even lets out a slight chuckle and responds that the winner could choose anything of their interest. Soon, Arthur extends his hand to seal the deal with the boy, as he already seemed determined about what he wanted. Then Seal accepts the invitation and decides that at least he would try to live in that game to defeat the first place. After that, Arthur forcefully plants his sword in the ground again. This creates a kind of teleportation circle that would take Seal directly to the tower. Arthur then warns the kid that this would be the last time he would be saved, and if it happened again, things would get complicated for him. When the king was finally about to start the teleportation, Sol asked for a moment of calm. He interrupted the incredible ritual of the guy to try to claim some equipment because he didn't want to be sent to the tower without anything to fight with. Sending him without any form of defense was quite irresponsible coming from someone who should be a caring god. Even in Pokémon, they gave something to start the journey, and that's why Seal earnestly asks the king for a little help. Upon hearing that he wouldn't receive anything, the boy gets upset and speaks arrogantly to Arthur. After that, the stressed girl who was trapped decides to put an end to that lack of respect. She arrives asserting authority and calls Seal for a little chat. She quickly makes it clear that God was not the boy's friend and did not give him that kind of intimacy. Listening to her scolding, Seal fills with fear and feels a rather strange sensation. He then concludes that this feeling was quite familiar and he had already gone through it in the real world. With all her powers, the girl puts the boy in a completely humiliating position, making him agree to the rules of respect in that place. From a distance, King Arthur watched everything closely without interfering at all. From his expression, he seemed to enjoy seeing the girl assert authority over that mere human. Suddenly, he starts laughing heartily, which leaves the two fighters a bit confused. According to Arthur, those kids had very funny attitudes. After laughing so much, he begins to get a bit more serious and focuses on what really matters. Then the king reveals that he had thought a lot about everything and had decided something important. As previously evidenced, Seo Jinheo showed interest in some equipment to defend himself in the battles to come. Based on that, King Arthur had made a decision. He wanted Seal to go into battle with that stressed girl as a method of defense. Upon hearing this decision from the king, the girl seems to dislike it very much and shows a tense expression. Seal, for his part, also expresses a certain disappointment mixed with a bit of confusion. After a few moments of silence, the two begin to desperately question that decision. The girl didn't want to go to the human world with an idiot like that, and the boy also disagreed with having the stressed girl as a companion. Hearing these justifications, Arthur asks both to calm down and tries to relax them. He soon makes it clear that that decision had already been made anyway and therefore could not be reversed. After understanding Arthur's side, the girl simply accepts this fact. The king then wishes a good trip to his crazy friend. He reveals that her name was Excalibur, and even though she was difficult to deal with, she was a very useful legendary sword made by God. About to leave, the girl shows a desperate expression because she obviously didn't want to go. Arthur, for his part, doesn't worry about that and just asks her to bring back some units of Melona. Then, without thinking twice, he begins the teleportation of those two fighters. He used a very effective method but harmful for the teleported ones. This is evidenced by the way Sale coughs practically without air at the end of the process. He even questions this alternative used by Arthur because it bothers him a lot. Excalibur, for her part, also seemed a bit unwell after the process. Sale then calls out to her, thinking of her rather ridiculous name. She soon begins to analyze her new physical state, which had changed after the teleportation. Upon noticing the drastic changes in her body, she becomes quite shaken. Seal tries to understand why the girl had turned into a child while she cried inconsolably. When trying to communicate with Excalibur, the protagonist ends up getting scolded and being blamed for all those events. Suddenly, the girl punches him in the face, which causes him to lose a bit of vital red liquid. Meanwhile, Arthur watched everything from a distance and reveals that he had forgotten to mention the side effects to them. Then the two fighters begin to analyze the place they were in, where someone had probably lived before. For the king, it was not fun at all to leave them in a very random place in the middle of nowhere. And for that reason, he decided to create a tutorial for the players who seem not to care much about that imminent danger. Seal, for his part, notices the presence of that monster, while Excalibur just complained about her new physical state. For her, the boy was ignoring her, but in reality, he just didn't have any reactions to deal with what he saw behind her at that moment. Suddenly, realizing that the monster would attack, Seal screams desperately for Excalibur to be careful. But unfortunately, he fails because the creepy creature manages to deliver a massive punch to the ground that sends the child flying far away. While she was still soaring through the air, the creature sees an opportunity to attack her once again. Excalibur, in turn, notices the movement of the guy and decides to prepare another one of those powerful punches. As she delivers this defense, she even groans due to the force she had imposed on her fist. After being hit, the big guy insults the girl, saying she was just a small rat. Then the fight becomes even more frantic, and the two start brawling wildly while Seal just watches, too worried about Excalibur. After a few moments of intense fighting, the enemies take a brief pause. Seal then asks if Excalibur is okay, and she replies that she hadn't seen the enemy approaching from behind her. After that, the boy decides to ask about the identity of that monster and why it was attacking them. The guy, in turn, just repeats the lines spoken by the protagonist, because it was something that gang of thieves, better known as Red Hood with a base rank, would also like to ask. Soon, the Red Wolf, who was a monk class player, tells the duo that the price for attacking that place was quite high. Then he asks if the two had resolved their childish fight, and he quickly orders his soldiers to capture the girl first, receiving an affirmative response from everyone. Without thinking twice, the men charge at Excalibur immediately with the intention of capturing her. It was for that reason that she didn't like the human world, and when questioned by Sale, she simply asks for his absolute silence. With no other way, she just asks the idiot to hold on tight. Sale doesn't quite understand what the girl meant by that and feels quite confused. Suddenly, the girl begins to transform and turns into some remnants of fire. Impressed, Sale watches this transformation speechlessly with wide eyes. As time passed, those flames transform into a sword above the protagonist's hand. Even the enemies seem incredulous at the girl's abilities and just watched her transformation without any reaction. With that ego weapon, the two fighters were capable of winning that fight easily. But then, observing the boy, the Red Wolf seems to fear nothing. Watching all that entertainment, Arthur starts to laugh. Suddenly, Sale lets out a desperate scream in the middle of the battlefield. He had just realized that his fierce sword had become nothing but a useless broken trinket. From his blank expression, it is possible to affirm that this fool would probably be annihilated, and the duo was screwed with no chance of victory. Excalibur was nicknamed the Ego Sword as if it were a true weapon with a soul, a true shield that grew with its master and possessed infinite possibilities. However, at that moment, it meant something not so good, because she was powerless and had no ability to defend her user. Sale, in turn, was in the student class, and his rank was the lowest possible, so he already accepted that he was screwed facing those enemies. Observing the completely useless sword, Excalibur was in a desolate state. The weapon was also of the Ego class, displaying the lowest rank possible, just like the protagonist. Excalibur had just had the worst experience of her life minutes before and couldn't believe the state she was in. At that moment, Seal was trying to communicate with the girl, who just wanted to be alone and get back home as quickly as possible. From a distance, the Red Wolf was just watching everything with a frustrating expression. Then he comments that he found all of that ridiculous, and that Seal's kind was complete trash. The Red Wolf soon announces that since the boy had ruined his troops' hideout, he would have to pay dearly for it, leaving him quite desperate. The boss's henchmen were already choosing which parts of that boy's body they wanted to keep. Seal's expression showed his concern as he thought those guys were really crazy. But there was no way out because if he continued like that, he would die again, and he needed to find a way to escape as quickly as possible. Suddenly, looking to the side, Seal realizes that Excalibur had gotten up and was heading towards the enemies. At that moment, she just wanted to make sure of the offensive remarks made by the villains to take action regarding that. Excalibur was very furious that those guys had put her together with a fool. After realizing the immense power that little girl possessed, they even considered the possibility of her being a ranker. Watching everything, Arthur notes that the girl had been very audacious in holding back some of her power. Without thinking twice, Excalibur begins to act, seeking the death of her enemies. In her first attack, a massive explosion is created at the site, and this proves sufficient to instill fear in those slackers. As they had never seen a skill like that before, the most viable alternative was to run away as fast as possible. But Excalibur already had blood in her eyes and had determined that the place would be the grave of those fools. Then she lets out a wicked laugh, thinking about how she would successfully finish that battle. Shortly after that, she prepares to unleash a huge flame to completely roast her enemies. But in an unusual turn of events, Excalibur ends up failing and cannot use her powers. She then falls into despair, not knowing why things had turned out that way. Realizing she was in trouble, she tries to apologize to her enemies, pretending that nothing had happened there. But the Red Wolf does not forgive those who dare to confront him and soon decides to send all his soldiers to finish off the two clumsy ones. From a distance, Seal realizes that Excalibur had failed to use her power, and his plan to run amidst all the chaos goes down the drain. In light of this, he decides not to run away alone and prefers to approach to help the girl in the fight. But upon observing what was there to confront him, Seal's eyes widen in fear. At that moment, the Red Wolf was close to him and was walking closer and closer. The eyes of that guy revealed his anger and desire for revenge against the boys who had caused him so much stress. Noticing this, Seal shows no reaction other than a frightened expression. Meanwhile, Excalibur bravely battles several enemies, still provoking them by calling them wimps. With no more choices, she decides to call Seal Yahello to take care of at least two evil guys. But her plea for the boy is in vain, as he had already disappeared from there a long time ago. Even realizing she was alone, Excalibur tries to shout the boy's name again to see if he appears, but in any case, she is unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Seal runs as fast as he can to escape the big guy. He wasn't crazy enough to enter a fight like that, as he was aware he couldn't hit someone like the Red Wolf. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that the place has become very quiet and soon assumes that Excalibur has been caught. Seal tries to push those bad thoughts out of his head while expressing his frustration with this new world he had gotten into. In any case, he wouldn't help Excalibur at all in that battle due to his weakness. But in the end, nothing changed, and Seal ends up tripping over a stone while running. He falls abruptly to the ground, making a huge noise at the sight. In the end, all this boy had done was run from reality whenever he could. After lying on the ground for a few moments, Seal slowly gets up, breathing heavily, and he says there is nothing more he could do there. He considered himself very weak and useless for being just a normal student in high school. After so many thoughts, he confirms that there was nothing he could do to resolve such situations. Seal then begins to have flashbacks of when he was excluded at school, kneeling alone in a corner. He was also in the middle of that place on his knees, thinking about the best thing to do at that moment. Suddenly, a chilling voice emerges, asking if he was running once again. To the owner of that booming voice, the boy's actions were very pathetic. He then gets startled and seems to have a reality shock, displaying a thoughtful expression. The boy's goal was to reach that tower full of wonderful prizes, but the path to get there was proving almost impossible. At that moment, the villain was humiliating Excalibur for having shown such confidence and ultimately failing to hold her ground. To him, the girl was just pathetic and weak. Excalibur, on her part, found it irritating that guy was saying those things since he was just sending his henchmen to do the hard work. While the Red Wolf called the girl rude, she just wanted a chance to win that fight with an ace up her sleeve. Then suddenly, the big guy prepares to attack, and finally, an opportunity arises for the girl to use her power. Without thinking twice, she begins to concentrate with the intention of catching the enemy by surprise. Seeing that Excalibur was about to take a fatal hit to the face, Seal appears to try to save her. The Wicked One and the blonde girl are then stunned to realize the presence of the runaway boy. As there was no more time to go back on his decision, the Red Wolf strikes with all his might. After nearly causing an earthquake in the area, the man begins to observe the damage he has done. There was no one else there as the two fugitives had successfully dodged the blow. At that moment, Excalibur was finishing off Seal with words, as she thought he was already far away after running off. She humiliated the boy, saying she would have succeeded on her own without his help, which made him quite sad. After hearing those harsh words, Seal fills his eyes with tears and feels like an idiot who couldn't do anything useful in his life. Excalibur then widens her eyes, realizing she had hurt the boy. Based on that, she takes a deep breath while thinking about what to say to the poor guy. After a few seconds of silence, she decides to break her silence to comfort the kid. Finally, Excalibur asks him to stand up and explains that she hadn't undermined the boy's potential. In an unusual manner, she asks Seal to hold her hand tightly, and she proposes that they fight together with the aim of defeating the wicked man. Still, with a tearful expression, Seo Jinheo just watches the girl, quite hurt by her previous words. But after a few seconds of staring at her, he gathers courage and decides to accept that agreement. Then the two make a pact of commitment with an emblematic handshake, making peace. Excalibur, in turn, seemed excited about it, giving a smile from ear to ear. Even Commander Arthur displayed a happy expression watching the two fighters unite. With that, he allows the fusion of the boys' powers, making them even stronger. Observing that insane power, the Red Wolf seemed unable to believe it. To him, it seemed much stronger than Nagi, the one who held first place on the competition podium. At that moment, Saul struck an imposing pose, seeming to fear nothing and no one. Excalibur's transformation into a sensational sword would surely help them win the battle. The adversary Seal Jin Heo needed to defeat was himself, with his weak personality. Excalibur was very stressed with that bastard since she was only going to share half of her strength with him. He was already approaching the Red Wolf but had drained all the girl's strength to reach his goal. At that moment, the battle between Seal and the big guy was already underway and promised to be frantic. Meanwhile, his frontline soldiers were cowering in fear of fighting. Then the leader of that group emphasized that he was the only opponent of the protagonist. He soon showed his disdain for bastards like Seal, who blindly trusted his equipment and advanced underestimating the enemy. This was the reason he had founded that guild made up only of thieves, but it made no sense to the protagonist. At that moment, the Red Wolf called for the attention of his opponents because he wanted to demonstrate how to use real strength. Then he delivered a powerful blow that made the entire ground tremble. From a distance, the big guy's henchmen praised their boss's performance in battle and moved away, fearing being sucked in by that incredible power. That dude even mocked the ego sword, saying it was practically useless. For if Sail didn't get close to him, he wouldn't be able to land any blows to win. Then the Red Wolf hurled a giant rock at the protagonist intending to crush him, mocking that he would sell his sword for a high price. But at that moment, the protagonist seemed to have a card up his sleeve as he remained calm amidst those taunts. Soon, he firmly grasped the ego sword, ready to demonstrate all its destructive potential. He stared at his enemy with a look that could instill fear in anyone an easily farmed aura. Then suddenly, Seol began to use his strength, startling the Red Wolf, who widened his eyes. Seol had managed to hold that giant rock as if it were nothing, and without thinking twice, he threw the artifact at his enemies. Watching that giant thing coming their way, the guys expressed very tense looks. After a few moments, the rock had annihilated that entire clan, sending them flying far away. Most of them were thrown into the air and mercilessly crushed by the boulder. After all that, only dust could be seen around the area. A few moments after Sail's masterful throw, he appeared amidst all that dirt. He looked very worn out due to the amount of energy exerted in that blow. Seol no longer had the strength to remain standing but celebrated the fact that he had managed to defeat his enemies. Inevitably, the kid ends up falling to the ground due to extreme exhaustion amidst a lot of destruction. Then, after this crazy fight, the information panel appears, informing that the Red Hood Thieves Guild has been annihilated. Seol Jinheo, who was in the student class and had the lowest possible rank, had defeated his enemies. Observing the entire confrontation, someone seemed quite happy with the outcome of the plot. It was Arthur, quite entertained, as it was now worth watching those fights. Then he throws his phone away in an unusual manner. With a slight smile on his face, he celebrates a great victory for himself. Such happiness was due to all the candidates being gathered for a real war. Finally, all his plans were starting to flow in that incredible world Arthur had created. Now the work takes us to another environment where the day was beautiful with some clouds in the sky. A person was walking around with their cart and their draft animal. It was an old man, seemingly harmless, with his creature walking through that vast area. The name of that animal was Mokiko, and its specialty was being very cute, and that guy guiding it was a veteran in the game. His name was Duke Pal Guac Willius, occupying second place, and his role was to be the driver of a cart, but his peaceful life had been threatened once again. This reason dated back to 30 minutes earlier when he was brushing his Mokiko. Someone had approached him and his friend, asking for a simple, harmless ride. The old man was soon startled by that rookie who didn't know who he was dealing with and probably didn't have a grandfather to call his own. But upon observing more closely, the guy was taken aback and widened his eyes. It was Excalibur, wearing the Red Wolf outfit and dragging Seal by the hair, confirming he really didn't have a grandfather. The girl then intimidated the old man using her mockery, inviting him to board. That guy, in turn, was quite nervous as it seemed the girl was holding a corpse. As they continued on their way, Excalibur complained constantly about how the old man was driving the carriage, and he, in turn, just kept apologizing, very afraid of losing his life. The old man was very angry at the disrespectful tone with which that girl spoke, but she seemed not to care and just wanted Seal to wake up from his faint. Excalibur was shaking the protagonist with all her might, wanting to bring him back to life. Observing the brutality of the girl, the desperation of the old man, who just wanted to be left in peace, was evident on his face. Excalibur was not at all happy with that bastard. He hadn't moved a muscle since he fainted after the battle. It really seemed that the protagonist had died from exhaustion. But Excalibur didn't care about the boy's death and only thought about what would happen to her now and if Arthur Nim would take any action about everything. Then suddenly, the girl lost her patience and hit the boy, calling him a spicy fried squid with rice. With this somewhat crazy method, the boy woke up and immediately started saying he didn't remember anything anymore. Excalibur found Seal quite useless and weak for having actually entered a vegetative state after taking his hand after the battle. However, the protagonist remembered that she was exerting some kind of incredible power very similar to a force field or something like that. In any case, since Seal didn't recall the rest of the process to reach that incredible state, all that flattery was practically useless. Excalibur, in turn, suspected that the kid had won the fight just because of his enormous luck. But it was practically impossible for someone to wield the magnificent sword successfully without actually having experience, even if Seal Jin Heo seemed quite stupid. To the girl, that bastard had shown a good side amidst so much chaos, for he hadn't just finished off a single weak person but an entire clan. The protagonist had perfectly used Arthur Nim's power. Suddenly, he called out to the girl, informing her that he remembered one more event, but in an unusual manner, he gave up on telling it, as it didn't seem that important, and was soon pressured to spill the beans. Then Seal began to recall the moment when Excalibur decided to make that agreement. In light of this, he sincerely thanked her for trusting him. Upon hearing those words from the boy, she was left speechless, seeming not to believe such gratitude. Then Seal tried to continue talking but miserably mispronounced the name of the feisty girl. While the protagonist was getting scolded and trying to explain himself for that mistake, the cart driver was planning to do harm with those chatty brats in the village. Excalibur, very angry, didn't understand why her name was embarrassing to say and kept fighting, hitting Seal, who was intimidated to say any justification. Suddenly, the boy notices something impressive along the way and even widens his eyes in disbelief at what he sees. Seal quickly tries to convince the angry girl to stop fighting for a moment to also observe what he noticed. Even unwillingly, Excalibur takes her focus off her anger and gazes at the horizon, admiring what she sees. Just ahead stood a huge tower that captivated the eyes of those two fighters. That place was better known as the entrance to the village. Moving forward, it was possible to spot some soldiers controlling the community's entrances. Noticing this, Seal realizes that the two were in deep trouble. He didn't have many resources with him to pay the soldiers, who charged to allow visitors entry. That boy was going crazy thinking if he should get a part-time job, while Excalibur merely observed his despair with mockery. Then the girl points out that she had stolen all the money from those thieves to calm her brother down. Upon realizing they no longer needed to worry about money, the boy begins to praise his friend out of sheer happiness for having thought of the wicked plan. Excalibur then takes advantage of Seal having nothing to complain about and orders him to establish a kind of subordination to always obey her commands. As the girl outlines the first steps to take upon entering the village, someone shouts that they were there. The old man was literally ratting out the two fighters so that the police would arrest them. According to him, the boys had threatened him to get a ride. Excalibur quickly tries to explain that he had only asked for a favor and that the old man had accepted it without issue. However, Seal treacherously confirms the man's accusation. Going further, the boy plays the victim as if he knew nothing, which infuriates the girl completely. Suddenly, the two start fighting inside the cart, but this is futile, as both were being accused together of having threatened the victim. And according to the guy, that wanted poster was evidence that the duo were active members of the Red Hood Guild. The old man swore up and down that his information was correct, but the two fighters vehemently disagree that they were part of any evil clan. Then one of the police officers fixes his gaze on the clothing of those teenagers. Based on the cloaks worn by the two, he concludes that they were indeed members of the Thieves' Guild and should be arrested immediately. Without thinking twice, the captain orders all units to surround the criminals as quickly as possible. Watching this, Seal and Excalibur become quite nervous, as it was all just a misunderstanding. While observing the scene around him, the protagonist notices something that catches his attention. There was a man on a hill, watching everything intently. He seemed to know everything and made a statement about those acts. Some travelers soon grew impatient with the wait caused by the commotion of such criminals appearing. Excalibur becomes anxious, seeing that those guys were urging for haste to arrest them, as they didn't even know what was happening there. At that moment, it seemed that Seal Jinheo was about to have a mental breakdown and would try to run away alone again. Then the girl decides to slap the boy to get him to pay attention and not cowardly leave. Noticing that he had been seen, Seal tries to deceive the girl by saying he wouldn't run away at all. He had recently decided that he wouldn't flee, resisting all his urges to hold back. In the protagonist's mind, since they were being arrested by mistake, if he explained the situation properly, they would be released and everything would be fine. Then a soldier orders the duo to exit the wagon and raise their hands, to which Seal immediately responds affirmatively. The protagonist tries to calm Excalibur in that frightening situation by saying he had a nearly foolproof plan to put into action. But suddenly, when he looks back, he realizes that the girl was already in the air, preparing to attack the police officers. She was quite enraged because the men had incriminated her without even knowing her identity, and for that, she would rip the guy's teeth out to make a xylophone. Realizing the girl's threats, Seal becomes desperate, as trying to argue with that squad would be useless anyway. Then out of nowhere, Excalibur charges with all her strength at the soldiers, intending to finish them off. After hitting one of them, she celebrates upon realizing that her physical strength was returning to what it once was. Even without the power of Arthur Nim, which Seal Jinheo had taken from her, she could handle the police officers with ease, and thus she provoked them. Noticing that the two weren't even on the list of players, the squad leader orders all units to subdue them. While all the soldiers charged at her, Excalibur thought about the phrase spoken by the commander about being competitors. She didn't know what that was about, but she would certainly show her strength to those fools. She was definitely the strongest person those men would face in their lives. Without thinking twice, Excalibur used her cloak to block the vision of one of the soldiers and attacked him head-on. Fortunately, this tactic was successfully executed by the girl. Then, not wasting any time, she began to face the next opponent and prepared to attack him. Her harpoon, after being thrown with great force, spun at an absurd speed. After a few moments in the air, the weapon struck the face of a soldier, leaving him completely unrecognizable. Inevitably, he was thrown backward due to the force of the impact. Excalibur soon realized that those opponents were much weaker than she had imagined, and if she continued at this pace, they would probably rise to first place with great ease. Out of nowhere, the bastards began to move in a different way, which caught a lot of attention. One guy, noticing the beating they were taking, ordered the summoning of Lord Ran as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Excalibur, for her part, did not stop advancing and annihilated anyone who dared to stand in her way. She wondered who that guy was and challenged him without fear at all. But that dude probably wouldn't even manage to call for reinforcements after taking a hit from the girl. Noticing an imminent danger approaching, Seal tried to shout to warn Excalibur, but his tongue failed miserably. Upon hearing a shout of caution, Liber became more alert. But unfortunately, that didn't help, as the enemy was already behind her, ready to attack. Seeing this, Seal became desperate and shouted his friend's name, fearing for her life. Then, as a way to save herself, Liber began to transform into a sword. Without thinking twice, she started moving toward her friend's hands to be used as a weapon for defense. After firmly grasping the hilt of the sword, Sail watched the completion of Excalibur's transformation. Once fully transformed, the girl questioned the nickname given by the boy and also informed him that she was already aware of the enemy's approach. Hearing all those words, Seal confronted the girl, saying that she definitely couldn't have handled that alone and without warnings. Excalibur became furious for being challenged by a loser, but that adjective didn't offend him at all. Then Seal left the girl curious by asking what the most important quality of a defeated person was. Immediately, he replied that he gained knowledge with each lost battle. Just as the prey avoided attracting the attention of predators, he always stayed alert to the most dangerous guys in his classroom. And his knowledge as a loser was telling him something very important, confirming the theory that that guy was quite dangerous. After hearing what Seal said, Liber simply responded positively, but suddenly, she noticed something that caught her attention and made her eyes widen. She was stunned by the trail on the ground of the place. It seemed like she had already lost the battle. Then the guys there shouted to Lord Ran, informing him that the fighter was trying to flee the area. With that, the guy from the class of defenders simply stated that he wouldn't miss the next time. Seal observed that mark on the ground, impressed by the skills that the guy had using just a piece of cloth. Suddenly, Excalibur scolded the boy who wasn't paying attention to the task and seemed to be a bit scared. The girl warned Seal about the dangers of that cloth, which had the potential to kill him if it hit. But anyone would know that after seeing that huge crack in the ground, and for that reason, the protagonist was extremely scared. In light of this, Seal couldn't run away and needed to retaliate, even needing to wield such a heavy weapon like Liber. Just standing up holding the sword was quite difficult, and so the boy wondered how Arthur Nim had created that without any effort. While he was thinking, Seal suddenly noticed something that made him wait a bit. Realizing this, Excalibur pointed out that the guy, due to his current level, could only wield her for 2 minutes, so he shouldn't hesitate to attack as quickly as possible. Seal seemed very nervous about having to fight to survive. Noticing this, Excalibur became furious because they had already gone through several tough situations, but the boy interrupted her and tried to explain. It was true that he was afraid to fight, but his question was about finding another alternative without the need for direct combat. Upon hearing this, Excalibur became confused and didn't understand what the boy had tried to say. The same then explains better that the main objective was to scale the tower to find the first place, and if they fought now, it would be difficult to enter the city around the building. Moreover, if Seal lost consciousness after defeating Ram with a stroke of luck, it would be game over for the duo. But that didn't make sense to Excalibur, and she thought he would just stand there until he fainted. Meanwhile, Ran was preparing to attack and was already stating the affirmation for the start of the combat. Realizing this, Excalibur goes into a panic and widens her eyes. Without thinking twice, she screams to inform Seal of the danger approaching right in front of them. The protagonist would be judged for crimes such as attacking the gates and interfering with law enforcement. Furthermore, that large hand would grab the boy to judge him for attempted murder. Suddenly, Seal is wrapped in several strips of fabric, having nowhere to escape. He becomes desperate as he is immobilized by that powerful cloth. Ran also informed the duo that they would not have the right to claim innocence. For given the situation they were in, there was resistance to arrest and attempted escape, and thus, the death penalty would be executed without chances of appeal in the case. Upon hearing this verdict from the guy, Seal goes into despair and even starts to sweat cold from so much fear. A few meters in front of him, Ran was using the cloth to completely immobilize the prisoner. He was staring at the protagonist with a serious look that would scare anyone. Sail, for his part, could not free himself from that trap and remained completely still, without reaction. That protagonist soon realizes he was quite different. The only one Seal could see in his line of sight was that man, as if they were the last remaining people in the whole world. Seeing that the guy had a very strong presence, the boy assumes that this man could climb the tower. Indeed, Ram was a true player. After a few moments of being trapped, Seal is questioned by Liber about his physical state and immediately responds that he couldn't move a muscle. But the boy seemed to have a card up his sleeve and was gripping the sword tighter and tighter. Then suddenly, he manages to deliver a huge blow to the enemy's cloth, freeing himself from the immobilization and causing it to shred. Seeing that Seal had resisted arrest, Rand becomes completely furious. Sumi decides to punish the boy according to all the strict regulations. Noticing the imminent danger approaching, Excalibur warns the boy, who informs her that he is already aware of everything. This was definitely not the time to worry about every little thing, as if they continued like this, they would surely be dead. There was no other choice but to retaliate against such actions as quickly as possible. Without thinking twice, Seal charges at the enemy, using all his energy. Liber, for his part, seems to like what he sees and encourages the boy to continue. Ran, meanwhile, was just watching the boy give his all to defeat him. Seal's body at that moment was overflowing with power, and because of that, he could perceive what Liber was talking about regarding having a bit of God within him. That boy felt a very positive energy, and based on that, he concluded that they could win that battle. When he was about to attack, Seal spots a group of people below him. Then he starts to think that those men hadn't managed to escape in time. Seeing that Seal had lost strength in his grip, Liber quickly questions him. That indecision made the girl tense, and she even threatened him, but the boy was just very concerned about those defenseless people. Down below, Rand was watching the duo argue, not understanding anything at all. He had no certainty about what those two were doing. However, they had lost the last opportunity to defeat the guy. Taking advantage of that discussion, Rand charges at Seal, intending to hit him squarely. Unfortunately, the man manages to strike the protagonist hard in the face. Due to the force of the impact, both boys are thrown to the ground and fall abruptly. Even the spectators of that fight are impressed by the man's attack and even think that the duo might have died. As Rand suspected, those two were indeed very dangerous. Even falling from such a great height, the duo had survived. Noticing another opportunity to checkmate in the contest, Rand begins to firmly wield his cloth. Then he would deliver another blow to completely end the battle, crowning himself as the victor. At that moment, Seal was lying on the ground, completely spent, with no strength to rise again. He had been careless and didn't know that things could end in such a tragic way. But at that moment, it seemed there was nothing more to be done as Rand charged at the two with a mega drill formed by his incredible cloth. Seeing that, even Excalibur was left speechless and simply closed her eyes, waiting for the impact to arrive. But suddenly, something seemed to stop the drill from advancing, saving the two friends. Gradually, Excalibur began to open her eyes, intending to perceive what had happened. In an unusual manner, what was there was a ball of fur seemingly trying to defend the duo. Losing sight of that creature, Liber widened his eyes as he couldn't believe what he saw. Rand then immediately stopped his cloth drill, intending not to harm the fluffy being. Soon, he wondered why Mokiko, such an intelligent beast, was interfering in the battle. Watching from afar, the spectators were also astonished to see the gentle, mystical creature protecting that duo. While Excalibur pondered in that atmosphere, everyone commented that the fight had to stop, as attacking a Mokiko was practically crossing the line. Mr. Rand, on his part, merely observed everything, reasoning about what actions to take. Gradually, he seemed to begin retracting his magical cloth. That element seemed to distance itself from Liber as if indicating a ceasefire. Rand's expression at that moment indicated a certain dissatisfaction, apparently. Meanwhile, Mokiko tried to protect the two targets of the guy with all its cuteness, but the blonde seemed like he wouldn't stop there and surely still had a card up his sleeve to put into practice. Then suddenly, he threw the cloth with all his strength towards Excalibur in a cowardly act, giving no chance for defense. The girl unfortunately ended up being hit squarely in the neck and was thrown back due to the high impact force. After that, Rand ordered his soldiers to restrain the two to punish them according to regulations. However, Mokiko seemed to dislike that very much. Unfortunately, the fluffy creature couldn't achieve its goal, and the duo ended up being thrown into the chessboard. After all that chaos, Rand headed towards a building where his superior was. That guy seemed not to believe the words spoken by the blonde and let out many evil laughs. The truth was that a Mokiko had obstructed Rand and also tried to protect the supposed criminals. According to the guy, this blonde had confused innocent people with criminals again, using a single plausible justification about a real attack on the gates. Then suddenly, the boss asked Rand to observe an item he had obtained. One of the villains was wearing that tie, and the different material used to make that accessory was somewhat suspicious to him. Then suddenly, the superior widened his eyes, realizing something very revealing. When informed that the tie was quite familiar, Rand quickly questioned his boss if he had someone in mind. The two then discussed the guy who had easily passed through Nagi's absolute domain some time ago, and they soon concluded that it indeed was that man. Based on that, the dean, who was a swordsman class and rank number 2, decided that he needed to meet Seal personally as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the duo remained trapped in a huge prison building. Next to the cell they were in, there were two fluffy Mokikos, seemingly providing moral support to the new residents of the chessboard. Inside, the brawlers found themselves in a deplorable state with a tense atmosphere. Sale, for his part, commented on the security of that place being a bit lax, so to speak. He also couldn't stop talking about the previous battle they had lost to the player named Ran and praised Liber for his performance. Meanwhile, the girl remained motionless, feeling so much boredom. With her head leaning against the wall, She sighed deeply, not knowing what to do. Noticing the critical state Excalibur was in, Sale didn't even try to bring up more topics, so he concluded that she was indeed upset. But the boy didn't blame her, as he would also feel destroyed inside if he were in her place. If he hadn't hesitated at the right moment to attack, the duo would probably have won, and everything would have been fine. Thinking about this, Sale began to bang his head against the wall, coming to the conclusion that he was just useless. But suddenly, Excalibur called him, leaving him quite surprised. In an unusual manner, the girl apologized for her actions, seeming very remorseful. After hearing this, Seal displayed a stunned expression, seeming not to believe it. In all this confusion, he decided to ask the reason for this difficult decision to apologize made by her. It really seemed that Liber was pretending so that he could hit the kid after he let his guard down. But soon she informed him that she was just admitting what she had done wrong, as she had initiated the fight on her own, dragging the two into a huge mess. With a rooster on his head, Seal informs that he understood everything, afraid of getting hit again by his dear lady. Excalibur had no intention of just apologizing verbally and moving on as if nothing had happened, so she decides to take full responsibility. Then, in an unusual manner, she asks the protagonist to hit her in the face without holding back. Hearing this, Sale becomes quite confused, but she insists that he should do it. It seemed that Excalibur always resolved everything with violence, which is why she continued to charge ahead recklessly without any thought or consideration. Suddenly, Sale's eyes widen as he seems to think of a better alternative without resorting to violence. Without thinking twice, he shouts the girl's name, and he asks to call her Liber because he felt better that way. Excalibur was too long a name to pronounce in an urgent situation, and based on that, Seal makes his proposal without the need for violence. The boy, however, was afraid that the nickname might sound a bit strange. However, Excalibur seemed to not care at all and accepted the proposal, making him very happy and almost unable to believe it. But there was still something more important. He wanted a kind of touch like true friends. Soon, Liber comments that it was time for them to try to escape from prison. Outside, there were some guards ensuring that no one would escape from the prison. That pair of guards didn't scare anyone and even fell asleep out of sheer boredom from standing still doing nothing. Suddenly, someone arrives, telling one of them that his job was taking a toll on him, and then he wakes up, sighing deeply after being startled. It was Sir Ran along with Sir Dean who, in turn, didn't seem happy at all with those bastards. They quickly start apologizing for their nap taken at the wrong time, but according to the chief, it only showed how peaceful the place was. Ran seemed much angrier than Dean due to the blunder made by the soldiers, who were even thinking of writing a handwritten apology letter. After his friend's angry comment, the second in command mentions the criminals caught at the gates and is immediately responded to by the sleepy one. Suddenly, a massive explosion occurs in the cell of those bastards, startling everyone present. Arriving at the scene, they find a giant hole in the wall. It was incredible that the duo had managed to create such a large opening to escape, but this brilliance would not save them from the death penalty. After such a well-executed escape on that scale, the two should expect a good retaliation. They would certainly be pursued until they were caught to serve their sentence. On Liber's shoulders, Seal complained about the speed at which she was fleeing, as he couldn't handle being shaken around like that. Suddenly, Rand finds them without much effort. Without thinking twice, he begins to retaliate against Excalibur to prevent her from getting further away from the prison. Suddenly, she starts to notice a change in her body weight that bothers her in an extraordinary way. Seal wondered about the principle behind this, as his body seemed to have become heavier than usual. But soon he realizes that he could move his hand very well, so that meant something completely different. What had become heavier was definitely not his body. All that weight actually came from the clothes the boy was wearing. Ran had already marked all the garments of those two, meaning they would remain under his control for at least half the day. Seal then emphasizes that they were not criminals, and the only reason they went to the village was to climb the Great Tower. Upon hearing this, Ran ponders these statements. The entrance village had been sought after by dozens of people like Seal, attracted by the shine of the celestial terrarium like insects, according to him. However, considering that those claims were true, Ran further recommends the duo's withdrawal, which leaves Liber very enraged. The tower was a place full of players, like that guy who thought he was better than the two friends. According to him, it was impossible to reach the goal under the conditions the duo was in. Then Dean interjects in the conversation and decides that such humiliation should stop immediately. Soon he approaches Seal, who was lying on the ground, and then he asks for the true identity of the weak boy. Looking into the guy's eyes, Sale feels a bit disoriented by the question. He soon realizes that the guy was not a complete stranger. Dean, in an unusual manner, says it's a pleasure to see the boy again. And then he introduces himself, stating his real name in a friendly way. He also identified himself as the Grand King of the entrance village. After hearing the guy's identification, Sale thinks this is bad because fighting one was already difficult, and with another player, it would be practically impossible. Already out of strength to fight, the protagonist asks what consequences he and his friend would face after being caught. Soon after asking this question, the boy's vision starts to blur. Seeing that the boy had fainted, Dean approaches his sprawled body, and then he lets out a wicked chuckle, thinking about the plan he would put into action to punish them. Without thinking twice, the powerful ones begin to drag Seal and Liber to an unknown place. After a few moments, the protagonist finds himself sitting on a bed with two ladies taking care of his hair. The situation he was in was not comfortable at all, as the women tried to tend to him like he was a little child, while some short ones mocked him. These kids made offensive remarks to Seal, which irritated him greatly. Soon, the protagonist is startled to notice Liber's presence, who was trying to convince him to eat a bit due to the high quality of the food. Seal then panics upon learning that even the girl didn't know where they were at that moment. When he informs that he wanted to escape from those monsters as quickly as possible, someone is bothered by that nickname. The protagonist had literally called the powerful Sir ran a freak in front of him, but the guy seems to overlook this offense, asking Seal to follow him to a still mysterious location. He also informs that the Dean was waiting for the protagonist at that moment. Without wasting time, the two immediately start walking to the designated place. Very suspicious, Seal walks, thinking about why Ran had changed so much after beating him and Liber. The boy was quite angry because the girl wasn't there, and without her, he was just an ordinary high school student. Finally, after walking so much, the two arrive at Dean's office. Then Ran asks Seal to enter first. After the door opens, the very nervous boy widens his eyes upon making eye contact with the Dean for the first time. The man was sitting on a sofa in front of a window. Soon, he notices the protagonist's presence and turns to greet him. Indeed, that duo had surprised Dean moments before. They had opened a hole in the prison wall to execute a meticulous escape, and that's why Seal doesn't hesitate to apologize to the Dean. That cell wasn't so easy to break, according to the king himself. Based on that, the man asks if Seal had managed to break Nagi's absolute control using that same ability. It was clear that the boy's weakness was fainting after using his power, and this ability was of great interest to the king. After hearing so many words from the man, Seal starts to sweat cold with fear. He didn't know how to respond or if he should tell the truth. It probably wasn't a bluff when Dean claimed to be the king of the village, and that justified why Ran always followed him. Based on a thorough analysis of the facts, the boy concludes that telling the truth might be the best option. But whether the man was trustworthy enough to know that the origin of his abilities was divine help became a huge doubt. In reality, there was a possibility that Dean wouldn't even believe his words. Soon, Seal is surprised to learn that it was perfectly fine if he didn't want to talk at that moment due to the tension. For Dean, it was common for the boy, as a good player, to want to hide his ability, but he didn't understand the reason for this question. The king then replies that he was just curious about the subject, but Seal finds that very strange. Without wasting time, the boy asks why he was called there, and Dean says he had something to give him. Soon, the king hands the boy the object that had been confiscated from him. As that was returned to Seal, it was a way to show that they were free again, with no pending issues with local justice. The boy, upon learning of his freedom, celebrates, thanking God very much for his innocence being proven and accepted by the king of the community. Dean then explains to Seal that the owner of Mokiko had sought the authorities to inform them that the duo was not part of the Red Hood gang. He said that his companions were safe thanks to the duo, and after seeking the authorities to tell the truth, he fled immediately. Remembering what had happened, Seal even lets out a sigh of relief. And soon he remembers the people who gave meaning to his actions so they wouldn't be in vain. His hesitation at the moment of battle had saved someone, and that made him very proud. For a few moments, silence fills the room along with the relief the boy felt. Looking at the boy, Dean wonders if this was really his true identity. The king asks Seal if he truly wishes to climb the tower, and he receives an affirmative response. Meanwhile, Dean wanted to know the reason behind the boy's desire, so he questions him if he would receive an answer about why he wanted so much to reach that tower. As if guided by something at that moment, Seal begins to reveal his intentions. Dean listened attentively as the boy spoke about aiming to be first in the rank. He needed to defeat Nagi to achieve his goal, and thus the boy answered Dean's question. Outside the room, Ran seemed to listen closely to their conversation. His expression was serious and showed no apparent feelings. At that moment, silence took over the place. Seal stared at Dean with a serious face, looking quite nervous until then. Suddenly, the king calls the boy, startling him. Then the man asks if Seal would look out the window for him. The boy quickly approaches and widens his eyes, impressed by what he saw. The view from the building was magnificent and had a privileged sight of the tower. Dean then asked if Seal could see the tall buildings inside the fence. The fact was that most of them were owned by the feared guild Avalon. That clan was definitely not a sight for sore eyes, as Nagi herself commanded them. Upon learning this information, Seal finally realized something very important. It was about the true meaning behind his declaration. The protagonist's goal was to defeat the feared Nagi. But this achievement did not only depend on defeating the girl, but also on fighting all the henchmen surrounding him. It was indeed a declaration of war against a huge organization. Seal had great doubts about being truly capable of doing this. He himself couldn't perform any relevant action in a small society like school, let alone win a war of this scale. Suddenly, Dean puts his hand on the boy's shoulder, saying he needed a strong guarantee. However, the king had already decided and planned everything to put it into practice. He would help Seal so that he could successfully climb the tower. The boy was very happy with this information, and Dean mentioned he had started to like him, as their goals seemed to align. forming a team could be very advantageous for both parties. Dean was eager to start working, but Seal felt a bit uncomfortable and asked the man to let him go first. The king, quite excited, quickly agreed to stop his overly affectionate display of camaraderie. Suddenly, Seal's name was called in the room, and then he was asked if he had already registered as a candidate for official players. After so many conversations, Seal finally began to leave the king's room. He celebrated the fact that he had finished that exhausting journey. He was happy to have found a way to climb the tower, but someone questioned him about this, demotivating him. Seal was startled, noticing the illustrious presence of Ran. He had been waiting outside the door during the entire conversation between the king and the fork. Ran said he had already warned about the non-existent possibility of Seal reaching the top of the tower, but instead of listening to him, the boy went ahead, doing exactly the opposite, babbling about absolute nonsense. Then Ran asked Seal if he really believed he could defeat the powerful Nagi. After calling the boy trash, this man authoritatively ordered him not to cross the line. If Seal wanted that, Ran could help him realize once again where his place was in that world. After hearing so many threats and nonsense, Lieber finally decided to take action to stop the slacker. Seal, quite desperate, even tried to contain the girl's excitement but was unsuccessful. She insulted Ran in every way and made it clear she would not accept orders from him at all. Lieber would make the slacker regret his grotesque actions, standing with her partner much stronger than him. After the girl's affront, Seal also joined the discussion, confirming her words. He confirmed that the two would become much stronger and would successfully climb the tower right after that. And finally, Nagi would also be defeated, losing her first place ranking. At that moment, Seal's expression showed all his anger due to the humiliation he had suffered from the slacker. Ran soon realized that all his words would be null and evident, not knowing why Dean liked those two insolent ones. With that, he decided to make sure to watch everything the duo promised to do, in order to see how long the insolence would last. After so many humiliations and unnecessary words, Ran finally began to leave the room. The discontent on the faces of the two friends was evident. Suddenly, Seal throws himself on the ground, showing that he really can't handle a little pressure. He was celebrating the fact that Ran had left while Lieber was asking for a drop of courage from him. The girl's intention was to strengthen herself more and more with her partner to later take down that slacker and anyone else who dared to stand in their way. Even looking a bit scared, Seal agrees with his friend's plans. After so many conversations, the two decide to leave there for a place that Dean had mentioned once. After arriving at the location, Seal clears his doubts after Lieber confirms that it was indeed the right place, as the appearance said it all. Finally, he begins to agree that this was the place the Dean had spoken about to him. What lay before them was the grand first portal. Finally, a blonde person standing in front of the wall confirms the presence of almost everyone and soon begins their important announcement. According to her, in a few moments, the selection of candidates for players would begin. With a privileged view, dreaming of climbing that glorious tower, the protagonist lamented not knowing where the test would take place. Lieber was already extremely tired as she ran around that village non-stop, believing that Seal could find the place quickly. Dean had told the boy that he just needed to follow the people who also wanted to take the test if the site couldn't be found, but that didn't make any sense to the girl. The Dean promised that Seal would recognize the participants at a glance, but this mission was not easy at all and seemed to be part of the test. Then a guy passing by and whispering bad things catches Lieber's attention. The voice in Jandraken's head informed him that it was not yet time to kill the duo of friends. He was thirsty for vital red liquid, and Lieber watched that, thinking he was a madman. Suddenly, she widened her eyes, seeming to realize something fundamental. He had finally found the very people that the useless protagonist had failed to notice. Soon, Seal was also observing his surroundings closely, noticing what was already clear. Some guys were sitting there, commenting fascinated about the creation of a weapon made by the dude with yellow hair. Another duo walking around the place really seemed to be preparing for some kind of test. Meanwhile, Jandraken continued talking to himself, asking for patience. All those people on that street wanted to pass the test to become true players. Seeing that, Lieber even considered the possibility of going back home, but Seal asked for patience. Suddenly, someone puts a hand on the boy's shoulder, and he immediately gets startled by it. That strange dude just wanted the duo of friends to step aside so he could pass without any trouble or fight. So without thinking twice, they step aside and apologize to the guys. Lieber's desire was to finish off the slackers, but Seal again earnestly asks her for patience. And in a somewhat desperate way, the duo arrived at the testing location, intending to register to become official players. In a conversation about the site being normal, Seal unusually agrees with Lieber. Those people were exactly as he imagined and would also be examined in that test. At that moment, someone was on the podium and would probably give instructions about the test to those interested in participating. This was the moment when the supervising player Momo began her speech, as we have seen before. There were only a few moments left until the official start of the much-anticipated test. According to Dean, there were no specific criteria for a candidate to be selected in the test and successfully secure a spot. The person just needed to show that they were indeed someone very special. With that, the duo just needed to showcase a bit of their best skills, like the one they had used to break through the prison wall. Sale shouldn't worry too much about that and just needed to proceed calmly, having fun at all times, according to Dean himself. Meanwhile, Momo was going from candidate to candidate, disqualifying those who failed in her analysis. Numerous candidates were already eliminated in this first phase, which seemed almost trivial. Then Seal realizes that this would be much more difficult than he had imagined, and Excalibur doesn't understand anything about the method used by the girl. Soon, the kid comes to the conclusion that there was a criterion for passing the tests since that woman was a player just like Dean and Ran, and they needed to figure everything out before they failed miserably like the other candidates. Meanwhile, Momo humiliated a guy, calling him a mere registrant. She wanted him to lower his gaze since an inspector was not obliged to have difficulties in their analysis. That dude even felt embarrassed and apologized to Momo, who continued to pressure him, saying she was not his friend. Suddenly, the woman takes a deep breath and seems to decide something extremely important for that little guy. Then she asks everyone to stand exactly behind the tall gentleman, and soon informs them that they had all failed miserably in the test, leaving them stunned. She had made those people wait 5 hours only to reject them without any explanation, which drove some mad with rage while others begged for another chance. They wanted Momo to clarify the criteria used for so many eliminations. Then she informs them that there was indeed a specific rule for her successful choices, and with a kick, she generates a huge explosion at the site. A little way off, even Dean is affected by it, spitting out all the food he was trying to eat. Immediately, Ran approaches him, quite worried about his physical state, and the boy informs him that he thought he was going to die for a moment. He soon confirms that there was a massive explosion very close to the testing site. It really seemed like the test was not going to occur as calmly as expected. From that moment on, Momo, as the inspector, would tell all the candidates at once the selection criteria for the player. Then she makes it clear that everything depended solely and exclusively on her own judgment. Upon hearing this, a candidate thinks that Momo was just doing whatever she felt like, but she seemed unfazed by anything and challenged anyone who disagreed with her method to a direct confrontation. Since most had already understood the message, she sends the rejected ones away and orders the organization of the rest. After that, all the designated ones take their leave without complaining about anything at all. Momo wanted everything to be this way from the beginning because for some, it was necessary to see with her own eyes that she had a much higher level. Suddenly, she hears a very disrespectful affront. It was Lieber belittling the girl's abilities, who boasted about being an official player but didn't even have a defined criterion for her dishonest test. Noticing the girl's excitement, Seal tries to calm her down but is aggressively reprimanded by her. If to become an official player, she had to turn into a tremendous arrogant, that condition would not be accepted. Without thinking twice, she asks the protagonist if he would accept becoming a jerk to secure a measly spot. Upon receiving this question, Seal displays a look of shock, pondering a response. In Momo's opinion, the candidates this time were a bit slow, and even after seeing the power difference, Liber couldn't understand where her place was. Based on that, she ignorantly asks the girl if she wanted a magnifying glass to see the obvious better. As Liber was very confident, the examiner invites her to a direct confrontation for a spot on the approved list and even belittles her powers. After receiving this challenge, the girl fills with determination and accepts it, provided that Momo truly keeps the promise made. At that moment, the air of rivalry between the two, who stared at each other with malicious looks, was palpable. The duo of friends had bravely challenged the inspector without caring about the consequences they might have to face. Those present had no faith in the victory of the two and mocked the horrendous situation they had gotten themselves into. That could affect them very negatively if they lost the battle, but that was enough to move the hearts of the candidates who were under the inspector's restriction. Meanwhile, the two fighters awaited a first attack coming from either side to initiate a sequence of blows. They provoked each other like never before, seeming to have harbored that hatred for a long time. Seeing that, Sale does not hesitate to try to stop the fight, offering to resolve it with just a friendly conversation. But suddenly, a massive explosion takes over the place, highlighting that his attempt to promote peace failed miserably. After that, those present commented in shock, trying to understand what had happened with the examined one that caused the mess. It seemed that that simple, whiny boy had shattered the inspector's golem into several pieces, with little effort. He was quite irritated for having been disqualified in the test. He claimed to have understood everyone's level and that everything was extremely disappointing, to the point of wanting to die. He wanted to exclude the lady examiner from the rest of the players and just needed a command from his captain to do so. Watching that little show from the boy, the two girls were confused by the bastard's actions. Then finally, Jandrakan receives the orders to go after the opponents. Momo found that quite childish since the guy had gotten upset over a simple disqualification. For someone who trusted in his ability, he complained too much, caring about other people. After saying those words to the upset boy, Momo looks around and notices something that catches her attention. It was simply Seal leaving there in a desperate manner without giving any explanation. Logo, he decides to warn Liber about the possibility of other people being dragged into the confusion as well if that continued. She then leaves there making an obscene gesture at Momo, who was lucky not to face her. At that moment, Liber just wanted to accompany Seal to protect the defenseless people. Suddenly, someone passes by startling the boy, saying that he should share the spotlight since he had already had his little bit of fun. Then this guy asks the protagonist to wish him luck and charges in without thinking much about the consequences. This highlights that Seal had forgotten something very important. There was a huge difference between the past situation and the current one. At that moment, the kid was getting closer and closer to Jandrekin, who was very angry and thirsty for vital red liquid. Then the psychopath doesn't hesitate and starts attacking the boy with his powers. With that, the difference between the two situations becomes even clearer. The people around Seoul definitely didn't need to be protected, as he thought. After hardly putting in much effort, Pastis comes out victorious from that childish fight against Jandraken. While Seol admired the boy's feat, Liber was angry because she wanted to have gone all out against her opponent. Momo, in turn, was also observing that mess with a very serious expression. Seeing that his powerful weapon had shattered into several pieces, Jandraken falls into despair, not believing the facts. Then someone arrives there telling him that it was time to stop being a burden to everyone else. The girl identifies herself as a simple examinee named Kina Lilette. She even tries to convince Jandraken to leave, but he refuses to take orders from anyone. Kina then says she didn't want to boss anyone around and that it was just a warning that if rejected, there would be consequences. Meanwhile, down below, two men dissatisfied with being dragged by the little fury challenge Jandraken to come down for a direct confrontation. Hearing those provocations, the hothead becomes even more furious, and soon he loses his head wanting to take care of those brats. But then Jandraken is stopped by two soldiers and promises to come back for revenge, in addition to casting a curse on everyone present. Claiming he would become a reaper, the guy becomes a subject of mockery in the place. Liber commented that Jandraken only barked and didn't bite, but anyway, Sale was happy because the inspector's attention on the duo had disappeared. Suddenly, someone in the crowd raises their hand claiming to have a question. He wanted to know what would happen to the candidates besides forming a single line to receive whimsical judgments before being disqualified again. After that question, Seol makes it clear that he was startled because that guy had appeared behind him again out of nowhere. The guy's courage ends up motivating the other candidates who also didn't want to wait any longer in that exhausting line. No one saw any sense in that silly test and still wanted to know about the approval criteria. Rumors said that only rich people passed, in addition to members of the influential Avalon Guild, and that left the candidates' tempers on edge. Seol soon realizes that the atmosphere was not good, and if the inspector didn't show up as soon as possible, everything could spiral out of control. Suddenly, Momo appears, saying that everyone had many complaints about the test. She was on top of the creature that had been cut into pieces by Jandraken. While Liber displayed her feelings of hatred towards Momo, Seol noticed that the stone monster was still standing. A man then expresses his dissatisfaction with the test because the inspector did whatever she wanted, and definitely no one would continue accepting that in silence. After listening to the citizen's statement, Momo shows a thoughtful expression. She looked at that entire crowd without saying a single word. Seol soon realizes that those people would lose control, and Liber also seems to think so. The crowd stared at the inspector with tense looks, waiting for a statement. Many seemed to be trying to gain patience amidst so much lost time. Even the quietest ones were completely out of patience. Finally, Momo seems to prepare a speech for the candidates. Then she asks them to calm down before saying that everyone would pass the test. This leaves the duo of friends quite confused. The necessary condition to pass that test was to endure to demonstrate an important quality that a true player needed to have, according to the inspector herself. If a person blindly followed the rules that someone decided out of whim, they wouldn't have what it took to be a player, so deciding for oneself was a necessity. After Momo's declaration, all the candidates understand very well and are pleased to be approved. Still, the pink-haired girl thought there was something strange about all this. She suspected a bit about things because the number of approved candidates was too high, but Momo emphasized that there was nothing wrong with that. The number of approved examinees ended up exceeding their initial predictions, but the reason was quite simple. There was a kind of representative who led the examinees to resist, and so Momo would add one more condition, for if she approved everyone, she would definitely have to send a written apology and a letter of explanation. Then she asks Seol and Liber to present themselves, and both respond promptly. With every word that came out of Momo's mouth, the protagonist grew tenser, widening his eyes. There was something the inspector wanted to say to that duo. She wanted them to show her a surprising skill, and if they met her expectations, she would fulfill the agreement, which was to pass all the remaining candidates who were there. After hearing the inspector's new condition, Seol and Liber seemed quite dissatisfied. But since there were no other alternatives, the duo accepted this challenge. Seol quickly asks if Excalibur is ready to start the show. It responds positively and promptly. Then suddenly, the two begin the demonstration, and a huge flash fills the testing area. Those present watch that ray with fear, worried it might be something dangerous that posed a risk to their lives. The girl with pink hair, observing that, realizes it was all about the legendary weapon Ego. But unusually, everything seems to go wrong, and Seal shows a blank expression as if he didn't know what he was doing. While the girl watched that embarrassing situation, the boy burst into laughter. After this disastrous performance, Momo decides to give the participants 5 seconds. At that moment, Liber berates Seal with words, claiming that the blame for that embarrassment was entirely his for having Arthur Nim's power and not being able to use it successfully. The inspector, counting down the seconds and celebrating the duo's failure, made the girl even more stressed. And so Lieber pressured the protagonist to put a special talent or something like that into practice. But Sale was blindly trusting the girl and didn't have a power to use as a trump card at that moment. Suddenly, the protagonist's eyes widen as he notices something that could change the course of this story. With the countdown nearing its end, Lieber loses patience and says that if Seal didn't take action, she would do it herself. But the boy takes responsibility and says he would handle it alone. With only 1 second left until defeat, Lieber's expression shows tremendous concern. Seal had become overwhelmed and ended up forgetting his one thing brought from reality, which was his powerful singularity. Observing that, Momo seems unimpressed by the boy's specialty, but he confirmed that the smartphone in his hand was the most impressive thing he had to show at that moment. Looking at that unusual scene, those present displayed impressed expressions in a certain way. Even the most bizarre guys seemed to pay full attention to Seal. Lieber, for her part, was on edge and wanted to take down her partner. When questioned by the girl, Seal affirms that the object was unique. After hearing this, Lieber freaks out and charges at the protagonist. He even tries to explain himself, but she doesn't give him a chance at any moment. If she had known it would end like this, she would have punched the inspector to vent her anger, as no one was impressed by the protagonist's demonstration. Momo, unusually, after observing the object that probably even she didn't know about, decides to pass that duo. Already choking her friend, Lieber looks at the inspector in disbelief at her statement. Sale is a bit confused to learn that the exam is over since Momo hadn't even heard his explanations before passing them. But she makes it clear that she didn't need something like that coming from the boy. With that, she impresses Seal by stating she knew it was a smartphone. Descending from the stone monster, she says she heard rumors about some things related to the duo, but didn't believe them even after seeing with her own eyes. With that, she decides to fulfill her promise gratefully. But Seal still had doubts about how Momo knew about the existence of a smartphone. The woman seemed to ignore the protagonist, who was begging for an answer. At that moment, all the candidates were being approved, just as promised by the inspector at the beginning of the duo's demonstration. Soon, Seal realizes that Momo was deliberately ignoring his questions about the smartphone. With a mocking expression, she tells the boy that he would need to find the answers to those questions on his own since he was now a full-fledged candidate for a player. After that, she bids farewell to Sale until she sees him again in the final exam. Finally, the protagonist had passed to the next phase of the candidate player test. After so much effort, Seal heads to Dean's quarters. This guy wasn't so sure what a smartphone was about. He was in the battle competition, and therefore didn't know what was happening in the world at that moment, and Seal had forgotten about it. Dean even tries to help the boy with these strange talks, but he denies it and claims everything is fine. After that, this short conversation ends, and Sale leaves the room of the guy. He thought asking Dean to take a look at that was being too needy since he hadn't done anything besides receiving his things. Since another person knew about the existence of smartphones in that world, it led Seal to suspect that he was not alone. He even clenched his hands from thinking so much about this subject. That was pathetic because whenever reality came back into focus, he trembled with fear even though he had decided to change. This bothered the protagonist a lot, making him feel like a complete idiot. In that hallway, Sale was not alone, as a guy was watching him closely. Suddenly, the guy jumps out of the building's window, and thus, he takes off running towards a previously unknown place. At that moment, Dean realized that something was about to begin, so he gives an order to Ran with the intention of finding out what a smartphone was. This guy definitely would not give up on knowing about the object mentioned by the protagonist. The green-haired guy claimed that this bastard had a strong connection with Dean, making his pursuit very difficult and almost impossible for anyone else. But the guy who seemed to be his boss congratulated him on the work done. That guy should successfully recover the item to earn half the selling price of the product, and the strange one who ordered this mission promised to fulfill the agreement. Without thinking twice, the boy decides to trust the proposal and agrees to keep all of this in absolute secrecy. Suddenly, just when he was finally about to leave, he notices something that makes his eyes widen. Then, in a few milliseconds, unfortunately, the boy is pierced by a very cowardly fatal blow. He already knew that this would happen at some point. The stranger who had promised loyalty had stabbed him in the back. For him, only the location of the smartphone mattered, which at that point had already been secured. No one should interfere with his cunning plan, because he would definitely be killed without any mercy. All of this was exactly as predicted. There was no sign of Dean anywhere. This was definitely the right time to start the plan. Based on this, the weirdo determines the start of everything. Meanwhile, Dean and Seal were together in their room with a light breeze coming through the window. At that moment, the protagonist was reading a letter and was impressed with the content within it. On the paper, a huge amount was charged to Seal, something around 6 million. Dean just made everything clearer by stating that this bill should be paid by him. All the damages caused by Seal, including the medical expenses of the guards he had beaten, should be reimbursed since the Dean had paid everything out of consideration. Upon hearing this, the protagonist asks about his jewels, but Dean informs him that they were returned to their owners because the Red Hood gang had stolen them. Sale would probably pay off the entire debt by working hard every day for about 2 to 3 months, and this made him very nervous. He wasn't even close to Nagi, and to make matters worse, he would have to stay still for a long period of time in addition to needing to find out information about the phone. Seeing the boy's despair, Dean states that there was another way to pay the debt. After hearing that the bill could be paid in just 1 week, Seal was amazed. All Dean had to do was teach the protagonist what to do, and he would complete the mission with total success. Soon, Ran and the duo of friends head towards a place where several children were happily playing. Seol was surprised that Dean asked them to follow that guy and found it very strange. Lieber could no longer walk, but the protagonist claimed he didn't know when that would end. Since Seol found out about everything out of nowhere, there hadn't even been time to gather more information about that mission, which made the girl very angry. The protagonist then tells Lieber that most of the debt was her fault for having beaten several guards. She felt very sorry for that, but in any case, she continued to be guilty. Noticing that small argument, Ram reminds the boys that they should follow him without making any noise. Without thinking twice, Seal covers the girl's mouth and confirms that he understood the message. With that, Lieber gets quite angry, but Ram could only think about what Dean's plan was in ordering that. He wanted the duo to follow the guy during a patrol around the village and had a good reason for it. If he could, Dean would take care of them personally, but he needed to leave the city for a while. And that meant one very important thing. Dean's left arm was completely ready. Ran was supposed to take care of the duo until the boy fully recovered, and after a period of time, he would be active again. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't understand Dean. He paid too much attention to two idiots who fought all the time over trivial reasons. Suddenly, while walking, Ran ends up bumping into something. It was a careless boy who had collided with his body and fallen abruptly to the ground. The very sad boy was brooding over the fact that his hot dog had been destroyed in that fall. Ran just stared at him, his clothes all dirty from the juice of that food. From a distance, the duo observed this, believing that the boy was in big trouble. Since that was quite bad, Ran probably wouldn't ignore this problem. But to everyone's surprise, he simply continued on his way, leaving the little brat behind on the ground. Lieber found this very annoying, and Seal seemed unable to believe that forgiveness was possible. Then several people approached, quite worried about the boy's physical state, and seeing that, the girl mocked the situation since it was just a simple stumble. For those kids, the fact that the boy had bothered Mr. Ran was a tremendous embarrassment. Watching the scolding the boy was getting for free, Seal suggested that the girl worry more about her friend's physical state. After the protagonist intervened, the very nervous kids also mocked the situation in a manner similar to what Lieber had done. Lieber even tried to strike up a conversation with the upset little girl about that brat, but was called a brat herself and lost her patience. Then the two girls started to fight because one of them wouldn't accept that Ran was called a bastard, and the other provoked her even more. The girl's father always protected the neighborhood, and that's why they defended him tooth and nail. Knowing that, the duo began to look at the man, thinking of his good deeds, and thus they realized that he was very popular among the children. Hearing this sudden opinion, Ran even thought that Seal had been sarcastic, but the boy denied it, as that wasn't what he was trying to say. Since they were talking about popularity, the man told the protagonist that he also had a considerable reputation. Suddenly, several cute little creatures surrounded the boy, leaving him scared. Seeing that situation, Lieber laughed at Seal while he begged for help. The protagonist should be proud of the friendliness of those little creatures. Mokikos were spiritual beings from the terrarium of the Celestial Tower, and that's why it was good to have them around. Even touching them became a difficult mission for an ordinary person. The little creatures dodged Ran's hand, highlighting this tremendous difficulty. Seeing that he didn't have the guts to get close to those creatures, the man expressed a face of pure disappointment. Then Ran noticed something that caught his attention. It seemed that the Mokiko protecting Seal was not a coincidence. Hearing this from Ran, the protagonist asked for permission before starting a question. Having that unique opportunity, he asked the guy if he had become a player intending to protect that village. After hearing that question, Ran just fell silent, seeming to think. Without that power, he would be a simple citizen incapable of doing anything, and that's why he followed the desires of those who recognize his worth. Based on that information, Ran concluded that he really did it for them. To condemn evil in place of the weak, he had become a player. After those affectionate explanations from the man, Sol stated that he understood the situation. But in any case, he concluded that he couldn't decipher the man's life. After hearing this, Ran just looked at Seal in a somewhat intimidating way, and said that he hadn't cared about the boys' understandings from the beginning, and so they continued on their way. Lieber soon realized that the atmosphere of the walk was tense and that it wasn't typical for Seal to give opinions about someone's beliefs. Meanwhile, the protagonist negatively related to the place of the weak. He quickly concluded that this wasn't what people really wanted. Suddenly, a huge explosion happened in the middle of the walk, startling the trio. Seal panicked at that fire, and Lieber noticed that all the flames were coming from the market they had just passed a few moments ago. Noticing the danger they were in, Ran displayed a devastating expression. The gang of villains was there, ready to wipe out everyone present. Their leader was already preparing his group to attack and made a point of taking care of the protagonist alone. In the wake of that explosion, the civilians became desperate and ran, fearing for their lives. Seal, without hesitation, asked what had happened and was informed about a crazy man setting everything on fire. He is stunned after learning that a stranger was destroying the village cared for by the players. When questioning Ran, the boy is informed that Dean was not available to help them in this endeavor. Due to the guy's absence, the enemies saw a perfect opportunity to launch that cowardly attack. Even with considerable concern about his guide, Seal receives an order to go to the guards and alert them about the invasion. After asking what Ran would do alone, the protagonist receives a mocking response regarding the clarity of what would happen in that place. Out of nowhere, the man bolts away towards the enemies, leaving the kid alone. Sale even tries to convince Ran not to go into battle without support, and Liber mocks this attitude. The protagonist becomes a bit pensive after these events and shows a sad expression. Soon, he decides to hurry to call the guards and would take a shortcut to reach the destination even faster. Meanwhile, Ran sets off with all his determination towards his enemies. He blamed himself for playing around and neglecting his mission, even knowing in advance that there would be problems along the way. Ran had not properly taken care of what he should protect with all his might, but there was no more time to waste, so he did not hesitate to keep advancing. Explosions were happening all around, but they did not intimidate the guy. One of the enemies was eager to finish off the village guardian at the entrance. He mocked Ran's delay. Then, without hesitation, he decided to send his henchmen to find their target. They, without thinking twice, complied with their master's decision. After a very short time searching, they confirmed Ran's presence, thus starting a fight that kicked up a lot of dust in the area. Without hesitation, the vandal began to move to defend himself from the guy. He tried at all costs to hit the fabric that Ran was using, but was unsuccessful in any way. After trying several times, he thought he had dealt with the Guardian's trump card. But upon observing closely, he noticed something that scared him quite a bit. It seemed that it would be very difficult to set that magical cloth on fire. After realizing what had happened around him, the guy became even more desperate. Ran had hit and neutralized 2 of his henchmen with a single attack. Those guys, in the enemy's opinion, were very useful, but the village guardian lived up to his name and did not give up on taking them all down. Then, without hesitation, Ran began to prepare a fantastic strike with his fabric and spun it like a tornado. He had to execute that devastating move without any mercy, and he would do it at that moment. So, without thinking twice, Ran charged at the enemy with his fabric spinning like a devastating tornado. Immediately, the guy prepared a shield of flames to protect himself from the attack. A few seconds later, the 2 combat weapons clashed, generating a tremendous impact. From the expression displayed by Ran, he would not give up the battle under any circumstances. As he attempted to deliver a flying kick to his enemy, the latter narrowly dodged the blow. This made Ran even angrier and fueled his desire to win that battle. The enemy, in turn, seemed to enjoy the fight due to his fearless demeanor. At that moment, the battle was already engaged, and the 2 opponents struck each other like never before. Flames, dust, and sparks could be seen all over the place. After a frantic sequence of attacks, the gray-haired guy finally managed to stop to rest and think about how to win the difficult battle. But that was his biggest mistake, as in a fight like that, one cannot let their guard down for a moment. Taking advantage of this, Ran delivered a powerful blow to his opponent's chest, sending him flying far away. Without thinking twice, he charged at his opponent with the fabric ready to finish him off. At that moment, Ran already considered the battle won and his enemy's defeat as certain. The guy, in turn, was agonizing, pinned against the wall to which he had been thrown. But suddenly, he gave a slight smile, seeming to have a trump card ready to put into action. This indicated that his henchmen were poised and were already coming at Ran from behind. Fortunately, he managed to sense that presence approaching from behind and literally took care of those weaklings. With a magnificent aura, Ran turned his cowardly enemies upside down in a highly humiliating act. Even immobilized and with no chance to react, his enemy seemed unconcerned about the situation. He truly would have never guessed that the yellow cloth was not the only thing Ran had control over with his powers. After hearing the guy, he asked his main purpose, and if it was not answered, he would kill him without any mercy. Oh man! Upon receiving this question, he mocks the situation because he probably wouldn't survive even if he obeyed that order. Then, in a defiant manner, he tells Ran that even if he won that battle, he wouldn't win the war, for the gang's purpose in that place had already been successfully completed. Meanwhile, a little distance away, the boss was talking to the protagonist, saying it was a pleasure to see him again. Soon the boy realizes that this guy was not a stranger and had encountered him at the testing site some time ago. Liber was already getting impatient and informed his friend that he wasn't feeling well about that unusual meeting. In just a few seconds, all those guys had already surrounded them without raising any suspicions. Seal quickly informs the strange man that he was in a hurry and needed to call the guards as soon as possible. He wanted to talk to the guy later, but apparently that wasn't going to happen. In an unusual manner, that man informs that he was responsible for starting all the fire and chaos in that village. Upon learning this, Seal asks the reason for such a despicable act, but the guy didn't want any interruptions in his conversation with the protagonist. No one could reach that place, not even the guardians themselves. The protagonist's doubt was what this guy wanted with him. The stranger then praises Seal's quickness. He wanted the boy to hand over the smartphone so that he could let him go in peace. While all this was happening, Dean was very far away and had no knowledge of anything. He was in the terrarium of the Celestial Tower. At that moment, the connection of his new member was going very well. Mary G. Zenos from the mechanical class was even joking, seeing that the pain wasn't as unbearable as Dean thought it would be. He confirmed this information and asked the girl to finish it as quickly as she could. She was already working at maximum speed, and suddenly asked the boy how the entrance village was doing, causing him to feel strange since she never asked that. To be honest, she didn't really want to know that information. She just thought Dean might faint, and that's why she questioned anything that came to her mind. In that sense, the boy informed her that he had a question to ask. He wanted to know if Mary already knew what a smartphone was, and this puzzled him. After a comment about this hot topic, Dean realized that she had an understanding of cell phones. Mary had heard rumors saying that smartphones were capable of evoking a special power within a person or something like that. And the most important thing was that no one should get involved with this type of item. While this conversation was happening, the duo was still being pressured by the strange man. By the cleverness of those guys, Sale realized they were doing this to prevent any thoughts of escaping. In any case, the guy guaranteed that if the smartphone was handed over, he would let the duo leave the place alive without major problems. But Seal wasn't falling for that talk because that psychopath had set fire to the whole place over a simple phone and would definitely kill them right after getting what he wanted. In any case, the protagonist had no other idea but to appease that cursed man a little to buy some time. But as he put his hand in his pocket to try to get the supposed smartphone, Sale took a punch to the chin. The high power of that blow made him fly away like a feather. The enemy had suspected that Seal would try something funny and decided to hit him to avoid certain situations. Next time, the protagonist wouldn't get another chance to stay alive, and seeing his worrying physical state, Liber approached to help. The girl was very angry with that cowardly attitude of the enemy and was cursing him without fear of consequences. Sale claimed to be fine and would obey the man's orders, even though Liber didn't seem to agree with that. In any case, the protagonist had already decided what he would do regardless of all the events, and Callie should just trust his actions from then on. Upon hearing these words from the boy, she just stared at him with an extremely angry expression without saying anything. Finally, she broke her silence and asked Seal to get up as quickly as he could. The protagonist wanted to avoid direct contact with the enemy until someone else arrived to help because he would be putting his life at risk having to battle against such a strong being. Trying not to touch the man, Sale began to hand over the smartphone casually. But suddenly someone arrived there asking what everyone was doing in the place. That child was trying to alert the gentleman about the fire, advising them to move on without chattering. Upon seeing the girl, Seal showed a very impressed and astonished expression at what was happening there. The villain, in turn, asked how the girl managed to get in there and her identity. The girl mocks the guy, calling him stupid for just having walked normally to get to the place. In this way, the villain realizes that his soldiers were very useless, and the child notices the grumpy tone of the guy after answering her question. Observing the strange mask of the man, the girl innocently asks if he doesn't feel hot with that stuffy thing completely covering his face. She thought he was a cosplay of some animation. But suddenly, the cowardly man attacks Seal and the girl, who try to save themselves as best they can. The villain tells the protagonist that his negotiations have failed miserably and that the smartphone would be acquired through his corpse. Hearing these threats, Seal doesn't think twice about telling Callie to run while he protects the defenseless little girl. Then he throws the phone for her to grab and run away right after. With the strategy mapped out in her mind, Callie starts heading towards the object with a fearless look in her eyes. Seeing that, the villain angrily calls the duo insolent. Fortunately, Callie arrives first and manages to securely grasp the phone that was in the air. Then she taunts the cursed crow, saying she was much faster than him, laughing at his failure. With that, Callie lowers her guard and doesn't notice several enemies approaching, ready to attack her. After this slip-up, unfortunately, she ends up being attacked by the guys who don't let that mockery of their boss slide. Seeing her heart sister suffering at the hands of the enemies, the little girl falls into total despair. Without any mercy, the cursed crow orders his henchmen to break Callie's upper limbs so she wouldn't be able to use the smartphone. These orders are immediately followed by the guys who start the dirty work. Callie's expression completely revealed the unbearable pain she felt. Meanwhile, the cursed crow watched everything, thinking about how pathetic Seal's plan was, abandoning his faithful ally and fleeing alone. But at that moment, the protagonist was putting his true intention into practice. He manages to set fire to a good part of the place in an attempt to draw the attention of nearby people. A little distance away, Rand notices a huge explosion followed by a flash that could be seen from several meters away. Soon he realizes that this tremendous force could only be the act of his ally Seal. The cursed crow, on the other hand, thought this was the main power of a smartphone. But seeing that there was no change around, he couldn't find explanations for Sale's strength. While the enemy pondered how the boy had the light of the chosen ones in his body, he congratulated Callie for the successful distraction. With this, Sale manages to get closer to the opponent, and it becomes clear that one move was enough to surprise him. Seeing Seal acting like a true player, the girl questions him about it, but there was no time for conversations, and she should keep her distance due to the high level of danger. The protagonist wanted to end that nonsense as quickly as he could, but the enemy wanted to know at all costs how Seal had obtained that magnificent power. Seeing how cocky the guy was, Callie interjects in the conversation, and Seal makes it clear that this subject was none of that crow's business. After this iconic statement, the protagonist charges at the enemy without fear. From a distance, a girl with pink hair watched everything. She seemed to enjoy the fact that she had found them. Seal had his famous one-hit attack, which ended up affecting the flow of events that would happen in the future in the entry village. At that moment, the defender Ran received a warning well in advance. The explorers who occupied the first place in the rank and belonged to the Avalon Guild informed him that the regulation of the situation would fall under the jurisdiction of that group. No one could give orders to Ran, especially people who hadn't moved while the problem only worsened, and that's why he protested, even being ridiculed by the guys. All they had done was trust the defender's abilities to control the situation in the best way. The damage from the fire began to affect the area outside the walls as well, and therefore the problem did not concern just the entry village. And at that moment, the only stubborn person left was Ran, the guardian of that life. With this, they reaffirmed that from that moment on, the Avalon Guild would take care of the entire problem. And this was not a choice but a true official order from the group. The chaotic scene in that place was noticeable in every corner, and loud sounds could be heard everywhere. At that moment, Seal faced his enemy kneeling before him. The guy groaned in agony and seemed unable to fight any longer. Seal realizes that he had probably fainted, and that for the first time, things were happening as planned since his arrival in that world. Since it was still early to rest, he asks about Callie's physical state. However, the sword remains silent and does not respond to the boy's question. With a very worried expression, Seal calls out again for his friend. Suddenly, the little girl appears there, and after asking a question, she is informed that her great protector was fine. Even feeling weak and sensing he might faint, Seal was concerned about the fact that Callie was quiet, and the cause of this was probably the injury she had suffered moments before. He always depended on the girl after using his ability, but this time the protection mission was his. Without thinking twice, Seal decides to leave there with the child and his friend. But suddenly that damned crow, which seemed to have been defeated, rises from the ashes and confronts the protagonist. The two, as expected, engage in combat at the same moment. Fortunately, Seal manages to defend a blow that would have caused him irreversible damage. The damned crow was very angry with the insolent boy who had not respected him in that battle and had considered it won. Seal thanked God for managing to dodge that blow, taking advantage of the adrenaline his enemy was feeling, but he needed to do more than that to win. The opponent wanted the boy's sword, which he was trying to hold onto in order to win the fight. Then the two clash again in a direct confrontation with frantic attacks. Meanwhile, the little girl watched everything with enormous despair in her eyes. Not knowing what to do, she tightly closes her eyes, wishing that all that traumatic situation would disappear as quickly as possible. Then she starts to run from the location, and this immediately catches the attention of the damned crow. He did not want the girl to run and would cowardly prevent her escape. Seeing the inhumane act his enemy was about to commit, Seal does not hesitate to act. With a fearless expression, he celebrates the connection. That was his second attack. After apparently completing his mission successfully, he pauses for a few seconds to try to rest a bit. But suddenly a haunting voice emerges asking him about the item. It was still the damned crow wanting him to hand over the item because he needed it very much. He still had not repaid his favor to someone. Seeing that his opponent was standing again, Seal thought that the man might be some kind of zombie or something similar. Out of nowhere, Seal feels an absurd discomfort in his body, and his expression clearly shows the enormous extent of this discomfort. He was very dizzy and felt like he would vomit at any moment. After a few seconds standing, he seems unable to hold on any longer, and soon he falls to his knees on the ground, appearing to have no strength to get back up. The protagonist lamented the fact that everything had ended in such a disappointing way again, even though he had tried his hardest. He then apologizes to Callie because he couldn't even move a finger without help. In any case, Seal was happy that the little girl had managed to escape and wished her success in her flight. For the boy, all that situation was very frustrating. He just wanted to protect Callie like she had done in the last times. It seemed that everything was lost for the boy at that moment. Looking around, he notices something that catches his attention. It was the little fur ball that was there in a very unusual way. That was practically impossible in a situation like that, and it seemed that Seal had truly lost control of things. Suddenly, a voice appears asking if he had accepted defeat so easily. To her, it was funny to see how Seal could laugh in the dreadful situation he was in. Upon realizing who it was, the boy is left speechless, observing her. She was the woman from the player candidate test that Seal had participated in some time before. When threatened by the damned crow, the girl mocks his words. He should stop with his bluffs because she had already seen all his abilities, and everything had been very despicable. This was the time for the damned crow to stop taking things that belonged to others. Hearing that affront, the monster tells the woman to shut up and starts a new threat. Already attacking the enemy without even making an effort, she challenges him. The expression of despair on the damned crow was evident. Then, without thinking twice, he begins to move to escape that predicament. Suddenly, a huge hole opens in the ground, and he disappears by jumping inside. Seeing this, the girl thinks it very clever for the thief to have a prepared underground escape. When trying to give Seal advice to learn from that plan, she realizes that he was no longer awake. He had fainted from the exhaustion caused by the efforts made in that battle. Meanwhile, the cursed crow continued to fall into that deep hole. Finally, after a few seconds plummeting, he reaches solid ground. Mezcal shouted for Seol to remember his name. He promised one day to return to kill the boy and take that power from him. Then Mezcal continues his path through those flooded tunnels. Further ahead, a guy in white clothing was waiting for him with crossed arms. He seemed somewhat calm about everything. Holding his smartphone in his hand, he complained about the boredom he felt and seemed not to care much for that valuable object. Mezcal had nothing at the beginning of his journey, not even things that people considered guaranteed, like a family, was he able to have. The love of a mother seemed to be greatly missed by him. Observing that family, Mezcal noticed that the boy was carrying a fish that his mother had given him as a gift. That animal seemed to catch the villain's attention, who decided to go after the two. With a stone in hand, the guy struck the girl, ending the love that existed between her and her child. Right after that, Mezcal realized the horrendous act he had committed and regretted it because he didn't want to do that. He just wanted to look a little closer and had no intention of hurting anyone. Desperate and crying a lot, the little boy begged his mother to open her eyes. The little fish out of water also suffered from that situation while the boy kept screaming. Mezcal displayed a shameful expression and seemed more regretful with each glance he took at the desperate situation. After a few minutes out of the water, unfortunately, the fish also passed away. And that was how Mezcal's unfortunate fate began in the world of crime with frequent robberies and murders. But no matter how much time passed, he could never forget those eyes. The gaze reflected in that expression was as if a deadly curse had been cast upon the guy who wasn't thinking of doing that. The feeling was like the abandonment of a divine being towards Mezcal, according to that guy. He tried to console the villain, saying they were similar in that regard and that he would give him a lot of power to control people. Mezcal's only mission to acquire all those rewards was to obtain the item. Amidst all that water in that eerie hideout, he celebrated the fact that he had managed to steal the phone. With the object, he could finally repay his favor to that person. Suddenly, a strong energy began to take over the place, and a kind of explosion occurred, throwing sewage everywhere. In just a few milliseconds, the place was unrecognizable. Mezcal had also been affected by that. The place he tried to run to was a sewer system. According to that guy, this was the appropriate location for a rat like Mezcal. His gaze showed a certain distrust towards the invader of his home. Unfortunately, Mezcal lost the item and became desperate, searching to protect it. He had absorbed the enemy's attack, managing to resist successfully, and for that, the man owed him more credit. Thus, the guy said that instead of a rat, he would designate Mezcal as a cockroach because it was a more fitting nomenclature. The eyes with which the boy stared at him bothered him quite a bit. Mezcal didn't want the guy to keep staring at him with that familiar look. After a few moments, the guy in white clothing decided to attack the poor soul with all his might. The intention was to kill him without any mercy. After a few moments of fighting, the guy stopped attacking and looked around. Then he noticed something that caught his attention. What was in front of him was a real smartphone that was in the enemy's possession. Realizing this, he let out a slight evil laugh. It seemed that continuing this would be a lot of fun. Kina Lilith from the mage class was at that moment with the Avalon Guild. The woman with purple hair, amidst a conversation about the invitation to the group, called the girl insolent. Noticing the murderous intentions of the girl, the little fire warned her friend. That guild that was really planning something asked Kina to step back because the attacks made by them were not directed at her. They were supposedly maintaining the public safety of the entrance village, and the way they did drove Ran crazy and made her want to bypass the protocols. This information was contested by Kina, who disagreed with the attacks that she and the people behind her, who were on the brink of death, were suffering. Then one of the members of the Avalon Guild began to accuse those poor souls who were protected by the girl. According to him, those two were the source of the mischief that caused the sea of flames in the entrance village. So if Kina wanted to prove her innocence, she should step back and stop defending the duo. Ran had already figured out that the Avalon Guild was obsessed with attacking Seal and didn't know he was favored by Lord Dean. Regardless of the reason for this hunt, the guy couldn't help his friend at the moment because he was now in the position of representative of the entrance village. Hasty actions would end up violating the rules they had with the Avalon Guild, and that would give them the chance to break the walls to invade, causing serious damage. At that moment, the best thing to do was to leave everything in the hands of that woman who confronted the soldier carrying the bow. The girl with purple hair found this absurd and soon determined that Kina should be killed. With that, a series of attacks began against the girl. Suddenly, someone arrived there, ordering the immediate halt of these acts, and Rand displayed a stunned expression at that presence. It was just a simple child imposing himself against those powerful adults. Kahlua became irritated, noticing that the little brat was disrupting the flow of things. Then she noticed someone around the Avalon Guild. They had all been surrounded at that moment. The guy in the white cloak, without thinking twice, tried to discover the identity of that troop and to which groups they were affiliated. Soon he found out that no one there was affiliated with any group but sympathized with a specific person. They were candidates to be players and great friends of Seal. They had received significant help from the boy some time ago, and they couldn't ignore a situation like that without trying to help him to repay the favor. Then a silence took over the place, and the two groups stared at each other in a tone of rivalry. Soon the girl realized that Seal had managed to gather and bring the scattered candidates from Section C, doing a good job amidst all this confusion. But suddenly, her companion warned her to be careful because something bad was about to happen, making him very alert. As she imagined, a massive explosion occurred in the place without any explanation. All that force came from underground and cut through the ground as if it were nothing. Immediately, all of this caught the attention of the little group that noticed something had flown out of that hole. At that moment, everyone should prepare for the worst imaginable scenario. The members of the Avalon group displayed fearless expressions with an air of pure courage. It seemed that this had only been to send a message, and the triviality of the thing left the group of friends simply impressed. Kahlua then informed that an order from the leader had arrived. They should temporarily suspend that plan immediately. Nothing was to be done with the individual who claimed to have a smartphone in his possession. Kahlua became quite angry upon receiving this order and tried to question the leader, but her friend immediately reprimanded her. With that, she decided to back down even though she didn't want to. Seeing the Avalon Guild retreating for no reason, the candidates thought they were scared and fled, fearing defeat. But no one wanted to act hastily, and there would surely be a reunion to settle the pending matters. They would see each other again at the testing location for the candidates to be players of Section C. Rand didn't seem happy at all with the situation he was in. His anger was so great that he clenched his hands tightly as if he wanted to punch everyone. Meanwhile, the entrance village was in complete chaos. And then a week passed, and finally, Dean was back at the location. He was soon impressed by the deplorable situation in which his village was and wondered who was responsible for that true chaos. Finally, the entire process of fixing his arm had ended. Exactly 1 week had passed since that day. As if nothing had been attacked by an unidentified organization, the entrance village was ensuring the stabilization of the community at a rapid pace. Callie and Seal were also recovering quickly without major difficulties. The protagonist couldn't believe how fast his recovery was, and all of this could be thanks to his friend. After asking a question, Seal had the impression that Callie wasn't very happy with how she lost consciousness a week ago. The girl was in a state of great boredom and grumpiness, but that was understandable since if she had been with Arthur, something like that wouldn't have happened. Sale felt embarrassed upon realizing that Callie had heard all his comments, and in the midst of all this situation, a visitor arrived in the room. Pastis was the name of that guy, and the girl had heard that he ended up leading the help group that saved their lives. He dismissed all that fame because it was natural for the examinees to help each other, especially after also being helped in a moment of need. Taking advantage of that topic, the name Mezcal is mentioned in the conversation. He was also an examined colleague and had almost killed Pastis once. But a big question was who had attacked the entrance village, causing such great damage. Pastis claimed there were more than one suspicious factor in the situation, besides the captured criminals having disappeared without leaving any clues about the faces of the other bandits. But anyway, another topic was also very important. Sale should take good care of his health to recover as quickly as possible. They were the only crazies who had the courage to risk their lives to fight, but Callie found it strange how Pastis treated them as if they were close. While Seal thought about the tower, the two were fighting fiercely over some simple tangerines. According to the protagonist, Nagi, the top-ranked player, resided there, but he knew nothing about that building. With that, Seal asks Pastis if fights were a frequent occurrence in the tower, as people fought for their lives there as if it were normal. Upon receiving this question, the boy realizes that the protagonist really knew nothing about the building. In that moment, Seal sees an opportunity to gain some lessons on the subject, but Pastis reveals he has no interest in giving them. The protagonist gets a bit angry at receiving a no as an answer, but the boy is firm in his decision. After all, they were just simple colleagues who had met during the test to become players. When something related to that subject came up, everyone had to treat each other like true enemies, forgetting about friendships. Therefore, Pastis couldn't give him any information about the tower. Suddenly, while giving a moral lesson about the facts of life and telling Sale not to be disappointed, this boy gets hit hard. It was just another group of visitors for the duo. They wanted to give a congratulatory gift for Seal being discharged, but he was trying to organize that troop to enter one at a time due to the small space of the room. Sale needed to get everyone out of there immediately because now Pastis was also a person in treatment. Suddenly, another guest appears in the room. The protagonist becomes desperate with this news since they didn't even have a discharge note for those crazies to be crowding there with so much excitement. Noticing that chaotic situation, Rand feels a bit confused. Seeing his presence, those fools display embarrassed expressions due to the mess. The reason the guy was there was still a mystery to everyone, but everyone was probably screwed. Now the scene takes us 3 hours back, specifically to the outer wall at the entrance of the village. A very strange movement was happening at that location at that very moment. Suddenly, a huge bang could be heard, and even the birds were startled by it. This noise was followed by a massive explosion that destroyed a lot around it. The cause of all that was Rand with his crazy cloth. He snapped his fingers at that moment to ease the tension and continue his actions. Rand seemed unwell by the look on his face. After a brief rest, he firmly wielded his weapon. In his mind, several flashbacks passed, one of them being with Sale. This made him even tenser, and his expression showed it. Then he struck more blows at his fictional opponents with all his strength. In the most difficult moments, he couldn't do anything, and that made him feel bad. and this contradicted all his claims about his competence. For Ran, this was definitely very pathetic. Words like celestial tower, terrarium, and player were hated by him. Just as insects are attracted to flowers, these nouns attracted power-hungry sick people. And the people who claimed to have gone to the tower in search of their dreams were no different from the trash that constantly stole from others. Based on that, Ran hated that kind of people with all his heart. But still, something quite unusual happened. Ran ended up being saved by the same people he hated with body and soul. At that moment, the boy questioned him about his actions. Without hesitation, Ran stated that if it weren't for that group, the whole village would have been engulfed in flames. That act might seem a bit ridiculous, but he was trying to express all his gratitude both as a defender and as a player. Suddenly, the girl with pink hair also appears there, apologizing for her delay, justifying that she couldn't find a flower shop nearby. Soon, she notices that something was wrong and that the atmosphere was not pleasant. After that, Ran thought a lot, wondering why. He and Seal did not understand each other at all. In that case, he decided that he would try to accept them. That was the best way to try to repay the debt to the guy. Upon arriving there, Ran immediately apologizes to Dean for the delay. "Oh man, forgive your friend for this and say that he was planning to test his arm, but something unusual happened." In a simple start to the test, his member ended up destroying everything in front of him. At that very moment, Seal was receiving back his smartphone that he thought he would never see again. When questioning Lilith, the protagonist is informed that the object was found in the sewers, but no culprit was seen there. In any case, Kina only cared about the debt and would leave there after paying it. Callie found it strange that the phone had been found in the sewer after so much fighting to get it, and Seal assumed that the object had been confused with something else. Then the protagonist concludes that there really were other people from reality there. Suddenly, the phone starts ringing and the boy is startled by it. He thought that something like that wouldn't be possible at the moment, and Callie was pressing him to answer. The call line had identification restrictions to not reveal the sender's number, so Seal decides to answer the call, even though he is very nervous. Putting the phone to his ear, he says hello to whoever was on the other end of the call. The man celebrates the fact that Seal answered because the phone had been successfully returned to its owner. While Callie asked who was on the line, the man mocked the protagonist for losing his valuable object. The guy also asks if Seal was okay. After that, the protagonist asks the same question to the mysterious man. According to the guy, he thought he was the only special one in that world. That's why Kim Taewon from the Avalon Guild decides that he should visit Seal soon. A smartphone was the only item that connected Seal to the world he had come from. Through this object, he had a fleeting hope that he could communicate with another person in reality. However, he would have never imagined one thing. That individual was indeed Kim Taewon. On a dark night in the city, the two would meet again. Kim Taewon didn't expect Seal to arrive there alone without the company of any friends. Without thinking twice, the protagonist asks how he had arrived in that world and the reason for making such a serious transition. Taewon soon reveals that Seal was not the only one who had met the region of that place. Upon hearing this, the protagonist displays a look of considerable nervousness. On the other hand, Kim Taewon seemed calm about everything, and his face clearly showed it. He then tells Seal that they had a more urgent problem at hand at that moment. Taewon had heard that the protagonist was impersonating him using his smartphone, just like back then. After being pressured this way, Seal is left speechless to explain, and he sums it all up as just a misunderstanding. Taewon was not at all interested in cleaning up the kid's mess in that world either. Seal felt even more intimidated after the man placed his hand on his left shoulder. Then he expresses a thoughtful look, and after a few moments, he apologizes to Taewon. With that, the kid realizes that the protagonist is the same as always and hasn't changed a bit. Taewon found the boy very pathetic. In any case, he would let the supposed accusation made minutes earlier slide since it wasn't the first time Seal had done something like that. But in return, Taewon wanted something that cost the protagonist a lot. He could not go for the player exam. After hearing this proposal, Seal denies wanting to comply. Kim Taewon, in turn, does not understand the boy's denial. Then Seal sincerely states that he would climb the tower. But that was not the only response from the kid. Holding his phone tightly in his hand, he looks around the place. And after noticing a quantity of water, he throws the object into it without any remorse. With this iconic attitude, he swears that he never tried to impersonate Taewon. After that, the villain tells Seal to wake up to reality since he was not the main character of this story. But none of those words mattered to the protagonist, who wanted to climb the tower at all costs and was firm on that decision. That affront left Kim Taewon quite angry. Then he admits that Seal had changed in some aspect. In that case, he would personally find a way for the kid not to be able to climb the tower. Noticing the red light that Taewon radiated, Seal thinks that he too received the power of a god in his body. Suddenly, someone familiar arrives there using his incredible cloth. Without thinking twice, Ran uses his weapon to immobilize the guy who was plotting against the protagonist. He certainly arrived at the right time to defend his great friend. Then he orders Seal to return to the mansion because there was someone worried about him. Taewon, noticing Ran's presence, states that he was a character he himself liked a lot. The man was very angry with Kim because using his skills against a civilian clearly violated the rules, and therefore he would proceed with the application of the appropriate punishment. But Taewon did not fear those threats as he trusted in his potential, and if Ran wanted to enforce his obligations, he would need to call someone stronger to fight. He was impressed that the kid managed to tear the cloth after using his ability. Then Ran charged at Taewon again with all his strength. Without thinking twice, the boy began to defend himself against that cloth. Taewon easily dodged the attacks, and based on some movements, Ran thought he was planning to pull out his weapon. Mocking the situation, the kid reaffirmed that his opponent could not defeat him, and that it was nothing so surprising. After hearing this affront from the enemy, Ran pulled another card from his sleeve to keep him from getting too excited. Taewon then said he already knew about the man's fabric manipulating ability, but seeing it in person was much more fascinating. However, there was another thing to be said. He soon stated that this power became useless if the target got too close. But Ran denied this statement and began to justify it through action. To him, this assertion was simply useless and completely untrue. After receiving an attack, Taewon commented that compressing the cloth to increase its speed was a good decision by the opponent. However, this card up his sleeve did not prove to be sufficient to defeat him. While talking too much, Taewon failed to notice that Ran had taken control of his rear, and in that small mistake, he was attacked decisively. The man with the cloth finally managed to demonstrate his strength by hitting the enemy. Seeing that opportunity, Ran did not hesitate to use his weapon to deliver a checkmate in the battle. With that, he launched Taewon far away at an absurd speed. For a few moments, only dust could be seen rising in the direction where the kid was thrown. Suddenly, Seal appeared, questioning the man about things that were not relevant at that moment and was told to wait a bit since the battle was not over yet. After taking a precise hit, Taewon commented on Ran's ability to control fabrics and his experience with that power. But he did not give up and got up with even more determination. He had already noticed how his opponent would handle the fight. Seeing that Taewon had not been shaken as expected, Ran and Seal fell into despair, displaying tense expressions. The boy then asked how they wanted to be beaten. But suddenly, just as he was about to charge at the two, someone called out to him. That guy asked if Taewon was the supposed rookie. The boy seemed excited to see the second-ranked player, known as Dean, as he looked exactly as described in the webtoon. Seeing how Taewon blatantly ignored his question, the boy assumed that his theory was indeed correct. Dean suddenly ended up being attacked by the kid. The attack and defense generated a massive explosion in the area, demonstrating the strength of those two opponents. Dean had stood in front of Taewon, but he had not noticed his presence, making it clear that he would need to be careful of the enemy's mechanical arm. Suddenly, Kim was surprised from behind, startled by the opponent's presence. At that same moment, a brief confrontation occurred between the two. The ability used by Taewon in that attack required Ran's permission, but he did not care about that rule and planned to use even more of the powers stolen from the village guardian. Dean then realized that his opponent was very rude and lacked good manners. Taewon only thought about defeating the famous guy who was in second place in the ranking and who was an epic existence. There was no way to let those actions go unnoticed, and so Dean would begin to correct the slacker's behavior with a good beating. After this warning from the guy, a huge flash took over the area. Dean had used a bit of his strength to attack the cocky boy. He wanted Taewon to get back on his feet again because that was just the beginning. After hearing this order, the boy informed that he was already getting up. Ran, seeing that situation, asked his master not to go too far with the correction and was answered affirmatively by the guy. After responding to his friend, Dean focused on continuing his plan. He wanted to proceed exactly from where he had left off. Taewon, noticing the opponent's determination, tried to appeal to the emotional side by bringing the village into the conversation to try to destabilize him. In any case, he had no plans to stop fighting and intended not to lose sight of the enemy in this second round. The energy that Dean emanated in that place made Taewon tremble at his core. The same said that this slacker must have a loose screw in his head. He didn't like that Taewon had brought his village into the conversation and thus held him without allowing even a muscle to move. Suddenly, a different movement arrives in that perimeter. It was Ran trying to protect Dean from the arrival of two more members of the Avalon Guild. Then he informs that he was in a terrible mood at that moment and had no intention of following the tricks of that group. Noticing that the team leader had offended the representative of the entrance village, the guy suggests a peace agreement. Hearing this, Taewon becomes furious as he had no intention of backing down, but his companion informs him that this was a direct order from the vice captain. As Dean could easily notice, Taewon was still not familiar with the non-aggression pact that covered the regulations between the Avalon Guild and the entrance village. Realizing these arguments from the guy, Ran assumes they wanted to ignore that event, but this assumption is denied by him. According to him, according to the regulations, the group would pay the price regardless of the amount due to orders from the vice captain. At that moment, Dean was staring at his opponent with a thoughtful look. The boy, although downcast, did not think of stopping the fight and wanted to see it through to the end. Looking to his other side, Dean observes another striking scene. It was the protagonist standing as if frozen, waiting for a decision from him. With that, Dean takes a deep breath before finally proclaiming his words. He just wanted those people to clear out because it seemed Seal also had some friends who got on his nerves. After saying this and walking away, he is confronted because of his friendship choices. According to Taewon, Dean would end up regretting his decision to choose that useless bastard. In any case, he does not listen to those nasty remarks, and everyone goes their separate ways. Seo, at that moment, was watching Dean with a guilty look. After the guy passed, he remained standing without showing any sign of retreat. Ran even looks back intending to understand what was happening with the boy. The protagonist seemed to be very angry and was clenching his fists with all his might. Finally, everyone arrives at their dorms under a beautiful waning moon night. Seo and Callie were already in their beds lying down, ready to sleep. But the boy seemed quite pensive and couldn't keep lying down in that place. Callie, for his part, showed a certain resemblance to the kid. In another room not far from there, Ran was still awake, taking care of his lethal defense weapon. Then he notices an unexpected movement there that catches his attention. Soon he decides to open the door to see who was there. After noticing Seal's presence, Ran is a bit surprised. Then the two walk outside the building together. Once outside, Seal, looking quite down, sits on the ground. Ran tries to advise the protagonist not to make hasty decisions as he had enough strength to act at the right moment, but the boy gave all that credit to Callie. Sale seemed desperate and asked the advisor for help in a rather iconic act. After hearing this from the boy, Ran appears shocked and remains silent for a few seconds, displaying a thoughtful expression. Then he finally breaks his silence and informs that he would find a way to help his friend. After being called to combat, Seal charges at Ran, who dodges his first attack. Not letting up, the guy counters the protagonist in midair right in his stomach. Seal, after taking that punch, is breathless and gasping for air, but the pain only gives him more determination, making the protagonist grit his teeth in anger. Without thinking twice, Seal charges at his opponent, intending to hit him hard. Ran seemed to be doing a good job as a sort of trainer for the boy. After hours of training, the sun begins to show up in the area. Marks were noticeable all over the terrain. Seal, for his part, was lying on the ground due to the exhaustion caused by the effort exerted. Seeing the boy's level of exhaustion, Ran decides that this was enough for that day, and even having been nice, there was a lesson he wanted to impart. He soon makes it clear that Seal would ruin his body and wouldn't get anywhere without a defined plan to truly change his situation. After all this, the protagonist realizes that he was a weak guy and couldn't do absolutely anything without Callie's help. With that, he comes to the conclusion that he should give up being a player and asks Ran's opinion to confirm this information. Hearing this, the man gets a bit nervous upon realizing that the boy had asked for his help just to complain like a grumpy old man. Sale denies Ran's statement and informs that he really wanted to evolve to become stronger. Suddenly, someone arrives there calling him a loser and mocking his actions. Finally, Seal lifts part of his body off the ground upon noticing Callie's presence. He was somewhat tense with the presence of the girl who displayed a disappointing expression. Seal didn't understand how Callie had found him there since it was still early morning, although the sun had already appeared. Suddenly, he notices something strange on the girl's face, and this grabs his attention. She was in tears at that moment, so he self-proclaims the true loser of that duo in an attempt to console the girl. She had in her mind that she was a loser because Seal had left her to fight completely alone, and this demonstrated her uselessness, along with other factors that had happened in the past. Without thinking twice, Seal states that he did this just to avoid involving her in anything, but Callie continues to feel betrayed by the promises he made. The protagonist denies all the accusations made by the girl and makes her even more nervous by stating that she was crying. He insists on this fact, nonetheless, and Callie tells him to shut up. The two then start to hit each other, while Ran watched everything. With this, the man becomes completely disappointed with that duo, and for this reason, he decides to work with them to help them evolve in the way they needed. For the two to become stronger, Ran would train them like a true coach. Upon hearing this from the man, Sale breaks into a big smile, while Callie had a more timid reaction. Then suddenly, the protagonist lets out an unusual scream of happiness, thanking Ran. Villagers were talking about rumors that were spreading through the locality. They spoke about how cool the supposed object called a smartphone was, used by a member of the Avalon Guild, who supposedly was the protagonist. Moreover, since Sale was posing as someone allied with the group, they went to demand explanations from the kid and then put him on their blacklist. After stating so many things at that dinner table, the guy confirms that it was just his theory. At that moment, the pink-haired girl was staring at him with a thoughtful expression about this information. Then, due to a simple eye contact, the guy thinks she was interested in him. Based on this, he decides it was definitely time to act and starts to undermine Seal's integrity, calling him impotent and dependent on his item. One of his friends agrees with everything and guesses that the protagonist wouldn't even show up on the battlefield due to the shame he felt. After that, the pink-haired girl informs that she was leaving the place. She said goodbye because she didn't have time to sit there just to participate in those totally useless conversations. Then, taking advantage of Miss Lilith's exit, another guy thanks Shannon for the food since he was also leaving. After all this chatter, the group finally leaves the bar. Kina Lilette was walking down the street with her friend calmly. Suddenly, the guy poses a question about whether she likes Seal. She gets quite furious with this silly question, and he just says it was a simple joke. The guy seems to regret having done that and shows an awkward expression. Kina, in turn, explains that she hated when people spoke ill of each other without even knowing the whole situation. And indeed, They both didn't have time to waste gossiping about others' lives. After hearing this explanation, the guy agrees with everything and continues his journey with Kina. Meanwhile, Ran was talking with his duo of friends about how there were only 10 days left until the start of the pretest for player candidates. With this, he presumed that Seal had hardened his determination. But since they had no time to waste, they would start the special training at that moment. The two boys observed the grandeur of the tower since they had never seen it up close. Ran comments that this was the only place in the village with this privileged view, and Seal questions him about the choice of this location for the training. Soon, the man replies that the boy would learn the reason much faster if he experienced it firsthand. After this statement, Ran activates a type of training equipment that forms a kind of line on the ground. Then he asks Sail and Callie to try to cross that barrier. The girl seems not to have much expectation for that easy mission, but the protagonist asks for calm since the activity needed to be done together. As she places her foot on the line, Callie ends up suffering an electric shock. This causes her to enter a trance state, not understanding what was happening. After a few seconds standing, Callie can't hold on any longer and falls to the ground, leaving the protagonist extremely worried. With that, Ran warns that it was time for Seal to try crossing as well. Upon hearing this information, the boy shows a fearful expression. But without hesitation, he begins to muster the courage to fulfill his duty. And after a few seconds of preparation, Seal finally starts to run with a bit of apprehension. Upon touching the line, he receives the same electric shock that Callie did. Immediately, he feels an inexplicable sensation. Everything was exactly like that time. After going through this crazy experience, Sail also falls to the ground in shock. Ran confirms some of the protagonist's thoughts about this place. Sail had reached an incredible mark of the outside world after crossing the border, and this was the domain of the terrarium of the Celestial Tower, according to his trainer. This area, referred to as a domain by the other players, was a location influenced by the tower, although it wasn't actually inside it. The reason Ran led the duo into that perimeter wasn't solely to acclimate them to the pressure in case they passed the pre-test. The main justification was due to the most significant characteristic of the terrarium of the Celestial Tower. According to Ran, the concept of death did not exist in the building, but in exchange, if a person's body reached its limit, they would have to pay the due price. This statement left the duo a bit confused, but it wasn't the complete explanation. According to Ran, the person would lose a small amount of their memories. After this shocking statement, the duo felt somewhat bored, because this problem was less serious than they initially thought. People who heard about the consequences for the first time usually tended to show that same response due to the supposed low price to pay. And so, for cases like these, it was much easier to understand if everything was experienced firsthand. After Ran's explanations, the duo showed interest in knowing what was down there. Upon looking more closely, Seal ended up getting startled by the view. He didn't understand what the hell that was looking at him. According to Ran, that place was called the Forest of the Defeated, an exclusive area for people who ignored the importance of consequences. Moreover, there was one more important piece of information about this abyss. It was that those defeated were also the opponents in the training that the duo would participate in. After giving these warnings, Ran pushes the duo towards the forest and asks them to do their best to survive. In that place, the man had left severe marks with his powerful cloth. The condition to pass was to find and recover the fabrics as quickly as possible. Finally, after a few seconds of free fall, the friends crashed violently against the ground of the abyss. From above, Ran simply watched them with a serious expression. His only mission was to help them in their training, ensuring the positive development of the duo over the last 10 days. If they couldn't handle that extremely easy level of difficulty, it would be better for them to give up because the people there were weak. The protagonist would have to face quitters who hadn't managed to become players. At that moment, he and his partner seemed extremely nervous, afraid of being attacked by the enemies. The zombies looked hungry for the flesh of those easy prey. Seeing that the enemies were about to tear apart whatever was in front of them, Seal asks Callie to get up quickly, even though she wasn't feeling well after the fall. After realizing that his friend wasn't in a condition to fight, the protagonist asks her to transform into a weapon to face the zombies. Seal wanted to finish this in just one attack since they didn't have time to deal with those strange things. It was better for them to find that cloth that Mr. Ran had hidden as quickly as possible if they wanted to pass the training. But unfortunately, after concentrating so much, the protagonist ends up failing miserably once again. Even with Ran giving them a bunch of tips from the start, the mission was not completed successfully. If they had played well and with a bit more luck, they would have succeeded, but the cursed forest was different from the norm and required a different perception. If the duo didn't give their all in the mission, they certainly had no chance of winning. At that moment, Seal was running desperately with Callie simply unconscious, complaining that everything was going so wrong at a vital moment of the task. After a few moments unconscious, the girl wakes up startled, realizing that she had dozed off when she shouldn't have. Without thinking twice, she apologizes to her partner and doesn't hesitate to show interest in taking down the monsters. But suddenly, the girl enters a sort of trance. Even she didn't know what she was doing or why she was in that state. Excalibur was the sword of the ego of God, and it had a very well-defined role to fulfill, which was simply to sit there doing nothing. Who would have thought that Excalibur would be murmuring to herself like that? But at least Arthur wasn't there to be a pain. At that moment, she seemed to be fulfilling her useless function quite well. She cried out to God, wanting to be heard at all costs because she missed the divine presence. But it seemed she had been forgotten. From the position and expression the girl displayed, it was clear she was not okay with that depressing situation. But suddenly, she reacts and decides not to be downcast by it all. The girl's goal was to reconnect with God so that her demands could be resolved once and for all. She would always be waiting for the divine entity and would not give up on waiting for him. For her, it was fine that God was a little late. Excalibur had definitely gotten used to that. She only asked God to give her a real name and not that of a weapon. It was supposed to be a striking identification that no one would forget. Suddenly, Callie wakes from those deep thoughts with her partner calling her desperately. It was Seal battling alone while she was somewhat fainted. The protagonist just wanted his partner to wake up and help him face all those horrendous creatures. Finally, Callie speaks up and apologizes to Seal, who was too nervous about everything happening there. He knew it was difficult, but still tried to ask the girl to transform into Excalibur once more because he didn't want to give up on the mission. The duo could win the fight if they worked with true unity. So without thinking twice, Callie starts to push herself to attempt another transformation that would lead them to victory. Fortunately, the change occurs successfully, and immediately, Seal charges at the enemies. Excalibur. At the moment, the boy seemed very happy, asked for his opinion. Soon she takes advantage of the duo's good moment in battle and decides to end this once and for all. After that, the two charge at the remaining enemies like a true avalanche. Seal and Callie took down all the zombies that dared to cross their path. Finally, after a few minutes of frantic fighting, they obliterated all the monsters that were there. Callie, without hesitation, invites Seal, who seemed to be feeling unwell, to leave as quickly as possible before more enemies arrived. No matter how many times they did that, the protagonist would probably never get used to that roller coaster feeling. Suddenly, upon looking a little more closely at his friend, Seal notices something that catches his attention. Kali's hair seemed to have grown considerably. The ego sword grew with its master, and that was probably what that change meant. After watching the duo's battle, Dean comments to Ran about how cool everything had been. Now he could ask the guy why he had left the two in that place abandoned by God. Dean had doubts about why Ran had taken the responsibility of leaving that duo to die there without anyone to turn to, and that was quite clear. 56 hours had passed since Heo, Seal, Jin, and Kali's party. This started right after they entered the cursed forest. If Seal had to recount all the strange things that had happened while the duo fought for their lives in there, the most bizarre was that hunger did not exist in that place. Instead, sleeping was a necessity because after a certain period, a person would faint for the wounds to start healing. This probably also applied to those still fighting in the forest, which is why they hid when night fell. So to find Lord Rand's cloth, the duo had to use the comfort of the night carefully. But it didn't seem like a good idea to wake someone so deeply asleep at that moment. With that, Sale decides he needs to sleep a little more to regain his strength. While the duo slept, the fire did its job of keeping away all the creatures that pose any risk. The dream the protagonist had that night was quite different from the usual ones. It was, in particular, somewhat incredible. After sleeping a lot during the night, Sale finally wakes up with a rather wrecked, lazy expression. Callie, noticing that run-over-dog face, asks what happened to him, and the reason is revealed with a certain tone of rudeness. Seal asks the girl to forget about it, and she wonders why her friend was acting so strangely. At that moment, the protagonist only thought about how to show Callie his appearance in his dream without seeming like a complete perverted idiot. After many attempts and errors with no progress, they realized that their own ideas on how to win were misaligned. So that's why the duo decided to always choose a target before they actually started attacking. This way, they could work as one and concentrate all their powers, finally beginning to understand how to evolve together. At that moment, Seal complained of a pain in his back, and the fact that he was awake impressed Callie. The boy had slept for 3 straight hours and only learned about it when his friend decided to tell him. Seal quickly asks how she knew this if she didn't have a watch to keep track of time, and Callie reveals that it was a hobby of hers to count time when she was bored. With this, the boy realizes that his dream was a memory of his friend. After observing his friend deep in thought, Callie asks the reason for it, and he quickly changes the subject. Looking on the bright side, the duo now knew exactly how much rest they needed after using their powers. Since Callie still had doubts about this, Sale wanted to test a bit more because knowing how many times they could use their abilities in a day would be very useful. Since entering that forest, the protagonist realized how little he understood about his own strength. And this realization also applied to his friend Callie. Suddenly, the girl asks why Seal is so excited, and he seems not to understand this very well. In her own reasoning about the situation, Callie concludes that Mr. Rand hadn't sent them to the forest just to help the boy mature. After expressing her opinion, she decides to move forward toward the center of the place. After walking for a few minutes, they find a large clearing in the middle of the forest, proving to be a likely spot for Rand to have hidden the cloth. Since the objective was probably there, Callie gets excited to finish this tiring mission, but Seal wasn't so sure everything would end that quickly. But suddenly, things go completely off plan, and a monster appears with the supposed cloth hidden by Rand. On the creature's arm, the sought-after fabric was tightly tied. Seal, upon spotting his target, is startled by how difficult it would be to take it from the giant. Realizing the monster was going to attack them, The protagonist desperately shouts for his friend to run away as fast as she could. The tense look was very clear on the boy's face, who was quite scared. Suddenly, the monster gets very close to Seol, who shows no reaction at that moment. Then the creature takes advantage of this opportunity and simply sticks its kind of tentacle to the protagonist's face. With that, the duo's defeat becomes evident, as apparently there was nothing more to be done. After getting out of the hole, Seol was very angry with Ran, who seemed very calm about the whole situation. Soon, the guy reveals that the protagonist had survived longer than he expected. Now Seol really knew who Ran was. It was clear that the cloth guy had planned to kill the duo from the beginning, as only a true psychopath would trap the objective in a dangerous monster like that. At that moment, Seol was arguing heatedly with his master, and Kali didn't seem comfortable with the situation. After a few remarks from the boy, Ran concludes that probably. Upon hearing this, Seol gets enraged and even grits his teeth in anger. But fortunately, no fight starts there, as he calls Kali to get out of there. As he walked away from Ran, Seol was suddenly grabbed forcefully by the neck. Before letting the boy go, he wanted explanations about where he was going. It seemed that he believed he had the possibility of dying again to that enemy. Seol quickly asks what he could do. There were no alternatives for the protagonist to try to win that battle, as the opponent was too fast and strong. After hearing the boy's words, Ran seems to mock what the boy believed. Then Kali gets angry at the trainer's shameless remark, as they had a plan to work together and become stronger. After listening to her, Ran questions her about her learnings from the mission. This makes the girl even angrier, to the point that her teeth start to grind. Hearing all that, Seol was in shock, seeming not to believe what was happening. He quickly calls Kali to leave, but she resists, stating that she hasn't finished what she started yet. Noticing that contrast, Ran mocks the situation and provokes the girl. After that, without thinking twice, she joins Heo Seol Jin. At that moment, the boy was already running through the dense forest. Seol was very angry because of Ran's arrogance. He quickly concludes that the trainer's pathetic actions were not right and that this was probably just another test to make them stronger. Already facing the enemy, Seol understands that Ran would not give them a task they could not overcome. The boy's focus at that moment was to grab the cloth tied to the monster's arm as quickly as possible. Kali, noticing her friend's concentration, questions him about the plan to be executed. After receiving silence, she calls Seol by his full name again. Suddenly, the boy shouts at the monster, intending to know its true identity. Even observing the human's fury, this creature did nothing but show anger and a desire to devour them. Considering the vulnerability presented by Seol, the predator decides to attack. Out of nowhere, the boy opens his mouth amidst all the chaos to introduce himself as if nothing was happening. Even a bow is made by the boy while the monster only wanted to eat him alive. Faced with this innocence, the predator begins a rather unusual reaction. Suddenly, he starts laughing out loud, leaving even Kali impressed and confused. The creature was astonished after receiving a greeting in the midst of battle and found it very funny coming from the enemy. Then he asks Seol what the topic of conversation he wanted to have was. Soon the boy reveals that he imagined he could defeat the predator just with the words from his own mouth. Otherwise, there was no apparent reason for Mr. Ran to have wrapped the cloth so carefully around the big guy's arm. After Seol's words, the creature suddenly begins to transform, and then reveals that all those statements from the boy were absolutely correct. Upon noticing the true face of that creature, Seol displays a look of complete astonishment. Simply put, the Agji girl was right in front of him. After staring at each other for a brief moment, the holder of the cloth hands it over to the boy. Seol feels somewhat suspicious of that kind act, but the girl informs him that she is just fulfilling an order given to her. The boy is stunned to realize that this mission had been so easy and that he had passed Mr. Ran's training without much effort. Suddenly, Kali appears there, scolding him for leaving her behind without saying anything at all. Being honest with himself, the boy decides to be positive about everything he has achieved on this journey and admits that nothing had been so easy since he went through a lot of pain. Then the Agji girl states that the cloth needed to be delivered to Mr. Ran. Even though she seemed friendly, she suddenly turns against the boy and decides to put an end to that nonsense. Noticing the imminent risk her brother was in, Kali screams desperately. But unfortunately, there is no time to catch Seol's attention, who ends up being hit and immobilized by the terrible enemy. The reason for that abomination's rage was her beloved children. Seol had killed several of the enemy's relatives before getting there. Those disgusting creatures were the monster's precious children. A little distance away, Ran begins to notice various pieces of cloth flying and concludes that the long-awaited battle had begun. At that moment, the trainer is questioned by Dean about the reason for some of his actions. The guy wanted to know at all costs about Ran's motivation for throwing the duo into that cursed forest, literally as bait for the monster. In a serious tone, the brother responds that it was all just a simple training. Upon hearing this, Dean shows a strange reaction, seeming not to believe it. Ran then explains that the teenagers had sought him out to become stronger, and without thinking twice, he agreed to that request. After attentively listening to this information, Dean slowly extends his hand towards the cloth guy. He then asks if by any chance the duo knew the risks they faced by being there. Everyone should know that those people from the Forest of the Defeated had once been human and were there for the same reason. Although there was a small group that considered the place a sacred site, in the end, It was just another cursed asylum by the tower, and that's why Ran could not fail. But he was convinced that everything would work out because the idea of failure had never crossed his mind. Indeed, Ran believed in the duo's potential, and if the friends failed at any moment, the guy would die along with them. After hearing these sincere words, Dean displays a rather impacted expression. Ran, in turn, had a fearless look on his face. It had been a long time since Dean had argued with him or had a conversation like this, so he decides that he will not ask anything else, and that was already enough. After that, Ran simply thanks his friend, but suddenly, Dean states that there was one more matter to be addressed. Ran should not say that they would all die together, as it was not his responsibility to carry that burden alone, but trusting them until the end was an obligation. While the two were having this conversation, Seal was simply being overpowered by the enemy. That monster made a point of knowing how many of his children the protagonist had finished off, but it was clear that Seal didn't know the exact number. After all, a killer doesn't count how many people they kill. After the enemy's words, the protagonist asserts that those deceased had attacked him first and he only had to defend himself, not necessarily wanting to kill them. Even with this very clear explanation from the boy, the adversary does not accept it and concludes that he was lying about everything. Noticing that situation, Callie decides to interrupt, saying that she was making a mistake by unjustly accusing the boy and should stop immediately. In any case, the monster doesn't care about the girl's words and threatens to kill her friend if any sudden movement occurs. To the enemy, it was obvious that that duo aimed to ascend the tower as soon as possible. She had seen many people like those two around, and all of them ended up becoming part of the forest of the defeated in the end. Based on this information, she advises the teenagers to give up because they no longer had a chance to reach the coveted top of the tower. Suddenly, in great agony, Seal cries out for Liber, saying that that monster was the main target they should defeat. After saying this, the creature drives its hand into the ground with all its strength. It screams loudly due to the unbearable pain it felt with its limbs simply pinned to the ground. In any case, the enemy had warned him not to make sudden movements as it would have a painful consequence, and if Seal continued to move, his forearm would be the next limb to be hit. That attack hurt so much that the protagonist's mind went blank, and with that, he realized that everything had been a trap from the beginning. She had killed him on purpose before so that he wouldn't feel pain and wouldn't be afraid to return for a new battle. That enemy had indeed managed to catch Seal perfectly, and he should distance himself from her as quickly as possible. The psychopath at that moment mocked, seeing that the protagonist was not bleeding. Although the boy was not bleeding after so many blows, he could still feel a lot of pain. Seal, for his part, seemed to be very scared, thinking he would die right there. Moreover, losing his memory was also possible at that stage of the game. And if all this happened, Sale would become one of those cursed children of the psychopath. So for all these reasons, she orders the protagonist to give up everything and surrender. To find peace, Sale should go back and inform Ran that he was giving up and no longer wanted to climb the tower. But fortunately, he confronts the psychopath in order to deny this proposal, for he did not want to lower himself to that humiliating level of subordination, and surely Seal would not give up even if it led to his death. Suddenly, the boy begins to emanate a surreal blue energy, and it doesn't take long for a kind of mana explosion to take over the place. Meanwhile, Liber watched everything without understanding what was happening. A little distance away, life in the village went on as if nothing was occurring. Now the scene takes us to the castle, headquarters of the Avalon Guild. In the audience chamber of the tower located on the upper floor of the building, a man announced that he was absent from the organization. Vice Captain Van Zikmund, who held rank number 8, was humbly thanked by his subordinate. That was the guy he had seen when he came down moments earlier, and since this man was in charge of the rookie, he had surely been through a lot. After hearing these words from the vice captain, the man felt very honored and stated that everything possible would be done to ensure his presence at the entrance. Then Van Zikmund asks his friend to take care of the player test that would happen in a few days, for that was probably what he was talking about. This theory of Van Zikmund is soon confirmed, and he receives the information that the location had already been recovered, but according to the investigation, an adversity was discovered. It seemed that there was no power within that object. Suddenly, a person arrives there saying that the smartphone is only useful when used exclusively by oneself. Otherwise, it becomes a thing of little relevance. Just with these words, the blonde boy left those two fools very curious about his secret ability. After that, the team leader T1 gets scolded because he couldn't enter or exit without permission from a superior, but he seems unconcerned and continues talking about his powers. He then reveals that there was a condition for this ability to be put into practice, but decides to keep that a mystery for now. After the boy's mockery, the man in white orders him to back off immediately, as such disrespect would no longer be tolerated. Suddenly, Van Zikmund interjects in the conversation, claiming to find everything quite interesting and asking for the identity of the cheeky boy. He was quite anxious about Kim Tae-won's future performance. Without hesitation, the boy responds with his head held high, realizing he couldn't see the man's face even though he was so close. Perhaps there was some ability preventing the boy from recognizing him, demonstrating the extreme caution Vice Captain Zikmund had regarding his identity. In any case, Kim Tae-won wasn't in a hurry to discover this and was primarily interested in finding the dean above all else. After that, the vice captain turns his back on the boy. The boy seems to dislike this rejecting attitude. Kim Tae-won would certainly repay this humiliation by proving that the man's choice had been very wrong. In 5 days during the player test, the boy would crush Hyo Seol-jin like a simple defenseless insect. He never respected or cared about the power that God had given to his opponent. Meanwhile, a little distance away, the battle continued, and Kali was impressed with her friend's performance. Not even the enemy could understand how Seol was resisting his deadly attacks so well. As usual, the protagonist hears an opponent asking him to get up again. People hated him, and receiving this request was very common in the real world. Hearing words like loser, pathetic guy, and useless became part of his daily life, and this seemed to give Seol the strength to face that powerful enemy. At that moment, the aberration just wanted to end that battle as quickly as possible, but Seol's mana seemed to corner him, making any escape plans impossible. Then the protagonist advances even further in an act of courage to show that under no circumstances would he give up. Even if he wasn't in good condition, Seol would show the enemy that ordinary people could also win using their determination. While being confronted like never before, the villain couldn't stop thinking about the protagonist's remarkable recovery and how dangerous that was. Kali, very impressed, immediately realizes that the monster was distancing itself out of fear of Hyo Seol-jin. At that point in the game, this seemed like good news, but something was definitely wrong with the protagonist. Kali had never seen anything like it. It seemed that Seol had developed his own unique abilities in that fight. After finally managing to calm the battle's tensions, the protagonist approaches Kali and calls her with his arm extended in a heroic tone. She stares at him for a few moments but soon understands what she should do. In just a few moments, the duo joins forces to try once again to defeat that aberration. The opponent, noticing their union, mocks the situation, saying it was very obvious that this would happen. And surely the monster wouldn't just stand there cowering and doing nothing. After hearing the enemy's taunt, Seol calls for Liber, who already knew what to do in that situation. The target at that moment was all those damned monsters. The zombies were screaming and could only think about wiping out those humans, so it doesn't take long for tempers to flare and a new battle to begin. After a few moments, a huge explosion occurs in the place due to the massive amount of energy unleashed in the attacks. After that, only a cloud of dust takes over the area, significantly reducing visibility. Seol had managed to defend himself from a very lethal blow, and Kali was worried about his physical state. She wanted to return to her original form as quickly as possible to support the boy until the end of the fight. But Seol denies this request, as it wasn't the right moment for that transformation, considering the battle wasn't over. With that, the entire plot continues without a predicted end. Even with so much determination, something was still missing for Seol to finally win that fight. He couldn't force himself to cut them down like simple vegetables for dinner. As soon as he thought their lives weren't different from his, he found it impossible to do so with such cruelty. At that moment, Seol and his opponent were face to face, almost starting another round of that endless fight. Then the monster approaches the protagonist, who was kneeling and seemed too weak to continue. Meanwhile, Seol apologizes to his friend Liber with a look of defeat, and it doesn't take long for him to be hit hard by the opponent. With the enemy immobilizing the protagonist, the outcome of that fight already seemed obvious. Seol had failed once again, and this unfortunately led him to defeat. When he thought it was the end, something suddenly touched his cheek. With what little strength he had left, he looked up, but in the end, he couldn't see anything. Once upon a time, there was a monster that wanted to kill you, but this creature had such a sad expression on its face that it seemed unable to do so. The enemy was mulling over doubts in her mind about when that forest had been entrusted to her. There was a time when watching the moonlight was the only joy in her life, and apparently, it was there that she discovered the true meaning of loneliness. After so much time alone, she finally had contact with a different person in that forest. For that guy, it was even hard to explain that he had seen a resident in such an inhospitable place. He took his friends to the forest, even though they didn't believe in this nonsense about someone living in the middle of the woods. When questioned numerous times, the guy lost his patience and asked the teenagers to follow him without further questions. His friends just wanted to go home, and this left him confused, not even knowing how to continue with this mission. But suddenly, fortunately, he spotted the girl, and his eyes lit up. The boy called the woman teacher, but she immediately rejected that nickname. Not caring much about the scolding, the boy introduced his friends, who were impressed by the facts, to her. Since they really wanted to be players, the boy called them to greet the teacher, who would probably lead them to that goal. Finally, those two managed to approach the legendary woman and greeted her kindly, albeit shyly. That woman didn't want to be the coach of those young people, and that was evident. Moreover, she had no talent for teaching dreamers because her power was innate since her birth. But in any case, she seemed to accept this challenge, for she missed interacting with real people. In moments when happy voices echoed through the forest, the teacher felt true happiness. Those simple human beings thanked the teacher for all her work. She even seemed to get sad knowing that the boys would leave the forest because they had to rest for the player test that would happen the next day. Then she noticed that time passes very quickly when one is having fun. Suddenly, one of the teenagers invited the girl to go to the top of the tower with them, as she would probably make it to the top 100 players without any problems. The woman, in turn, showed interest in this proposal but stated that she could not leave that forest of her own free will. One of the students quickly reprimanded the boy for his rude attitude, especially since the teacher didn't like leaving that place. While those two useless ones argued, the blonde took the opportunity to comfort the teacher with a strong hug and positive words. Even though they had a very dangerous mission to carry out, they would return safely without major problems, and she should wait for her students without worries. It was clear on the girl's face the sadness of having to return to complete loneliness without her dear friends. She took that emotional moment to praise the cuteness of her precious children. Without taking too long, she asked them to take care and return safely to visit her soon. A few seconds after that, the group was leaving the teacher alone once again. Once again, she was destined to be solitary in that place. So this was the story of how the monster began the long wait for the return of her beloved children. She constantly wondered how far they had climbed in the tower, hoping they wouldn't get into dangerous trouble. It didn't make sense to her that the teenagers wanted to participate in this uncertain mission instead of keeping her company in the forest. Even if they didn't become true players, she would accept them back as her precious children. The woman's expression while thinking of those special people was one of complete sadness. For her, it was all right if they decided to give up to return safely. Then suddenly, some very strange noises were heard nearby. They were some hooded guys taking a group of tied-up people. All those children of the monster were about to be thrown off that high cliff. After a few seconds, they were pushed by the hooded ones without any mercy. Down below, the girl watched everything very attentively. Soon, she realized that those bastards from Avalon were getting rid of more and more failures in the forest as if it were a garbage dump. Finally, after an absurd fall, those weak bodies crashed against the ground. She just wanted them to be safe because dreams cannot always be realized. It didn't matter if they couldn't become players as they had longed for, as long as they returned safely to the forest. Seeing the state her children were in, the woman ran to embrace them. In tears, she held the body of one of her dear ones, blaming herself for not having prevented those dreamers from going to the tower. In the girl's mind, she should have asked the teenagers to give up the mission the moment they were leaving. Suddenly, she realizes that the guy wasn't listening to her words. After that, the boy's hand roughly touches her face. It was actually Seal, apologizing for calling her loved ones monsters. Suddenly, while he was trying to make the monster stop crying, a massive explosion occurs there. With no time for nonsense, Callie had thrown a huge punch at the woman to make her back off from her friend. Due to the high force of the blow, the aberration flies meters away from there. For a few moments, she stands still without showing any reaction. She was trying to understand why Ran had sent that duo to the forest. For the fate of them returning as a zombie was certain, and thus giving up while there was still time would be the best choice. Upon hearing the woman's words, Callie becomes enraged and humiliates her opponent while drastically changing her tone of voice. If that aberration was so worried about the teenagers to the point of crying, she should simply help them. While Callie was giving 1,001 justifications, the girl told her to shut up for a moment. Suddenly, she also loses control of the situation, altering her tone of voice and completely transforming. In a desperate manner, the monster seemed to charge at Callie. The aberration didn't want to make room for new hope in her heart again, and thus tried to immobilize the girl. When she finally managed to leave Callie with no chance to react, the monster places her claw on her chest. At the same time, she was trying to understand some of those events. In an unusual way, her children were trying to stop her from doing any harm to the duo. It seemed that the zombies wanted their teacher to trust those teenagers. Even after all the situations they had been through, they still wished to give hope to the leader of the monsters. After this appeal from her children, the aberration begins to transform again into her original form. For a few seconds, she remains silent, staring at that duo who had made her so angry. After that, she asks for the identity of those two dreamers and is promptly answered by Callie. Then she says that it didn't matter how long it would take, but the duo should promise to return safely after realizing their dream of climbing the tower. Looking confused, Callie stares at the woman with a somewhat tense expression, and thus, a new wait began for the solitary guardian of the forest. 3 days had passed since that agreement. As soon as they woke up, the teacher started her classes with a very simple training content. Everyone would play tag for 3 consecutive days, and if someone got caught, they would die. Upon learning about this unusual training, the duo displayed somewhat desperate expressions. For Sale, those 3 days were the hardest of his life, and for Callie as well. After the training, the teacher was proud because no one had been caught, and thus she spared no praise for her friends. That was all she could teach, and they had done a great job as a team. After hearing that finally that torture was over, the two friends looked at each other for a few seconds in relief. For a few moments, they even seemed to argue, but soon they embraced and began to celebrate with compliments. While the boys talked about Mr. Ran and their performance in the activity, the teacher interrupted to ask them to listen to her until the end. That lesson was for the duo to learn how to stay alive against a stronger enemy. And this knowledge was the best so far to face a tower full of strong players because, in addition to achieving victories, a competitor also needed to survive. After a question from the teacher, Callie has a déjà vu, and Seal speculates that the woman would force them to do all of this again. She then responds somewhat mockingly to those two. Suddenly, she gives the green light for the start of a new activity. Callie and Seal displayed exhausted expressions and seemed like they couldn't take anything more. Suddenly, a massive explosion occurs there, destroying a large part of the ground. That monster had overheard that the duo was talking about her behind her back, and in that sense, they ended up saying something very interesting about hell. Therefore, from now on, Ran would show them what this place was really like for the remaining 4 days of training. Meanwhile, Dean was observing the tower from inside his castle. That was the long-awaited day of the player test. Many candidates were already eagerly waiting for the start of the event. Meanwhile, a show-off guy was trying to strike up a conversation with the crowd and, in addition, wanted to promote himself among so many people. What that guy was doing was embarrassing. It seemed like he just wanted to liven up the atmosphere like a clown. As the test approached, more strange people arrived at the location. According to the girl with pink hair, most of them were not much different from the first test, and that arrogance would likely lead to their downfall. Suddenly, a boy arrives, assuming she was looking for someone special in the crowd and claiming it was a potential boyfriend. After saying those unfortunate phrases, the guy takes a punch to the face with absurd force. The girl didn't like that kind of joke, and so the boy apologizes for trying to elicit a funny reaction from her. Finally, after so many hours of waiting, the guards announced that the final round of the player test would begin soon, and therefore the candidates should prepare. After hearing this announcement, the boy worries about the disappearance of Heo Jin, but soon the angry girl scolds him, quickly bringing him down a notch. Then she decides to go in first and leaves him there alone. But looking ahead, the boy is immediately startled by what he sees. He didn't even know what the hell that big guy blocking the gate was about. Then the girl with pink hair asks the monster to step aside and go prepare, just like the guards ordered minutes ago. Without wasting time, the abomination responds by telling her to leave, saying that this was not a space for women. After that affront, the girl decides to give the slacker 5 seconds to move away. He just mocks the situation and lets out a slight evil laugh. Then he can't help himself and bursts into laughter because it was so funny. Noticing how the monster was humiliating the girl, his friends start to discuss whether they should intervene to help her. That guy with long black hair was somewhat known around there as he was the only approved candidate and survivor from Group B. Suddenly, the kid asks everyone to stay still because there was no supervisor watching, and it was impossible to predict the enemy's movements. If an intervention were made at that moment, everything would turn into a big mess. Realizing he wouldn't provoke the girl so easily, the monster speculates some things about the guys from Group C, but in any case, he still needed to significantly reduce the number of people, so he decides to go after Group C with the intention of correcting their behavior. Suddenly, a boy appears in the midst of the fight and delivers a solid blow to the slacker's face. The girl with pink hair panics upon realizing that her ally attacked first, leaving room for a deadly counterattack. The boy was filled with rage towards the monster that called them trash and was trying to make him take back his offensive words. Meanwhile, the girl saw her friend's naivety fall for such a silly provocation, and now the monster would no longer be blamed for this fight. Then the enemy seizes the first opportunity to firmly grab the boy's heel with the intention of immobilizing him. Since he had attacked him first, all those actions fall under the concept of self-defense, and so the monster continues to take advantage of his right, throwing the boy to the ground with all his strength. Due to the unbearable pain he felt, the boy starts to scream inevitably. After that, the monster doesn't waste time and provokes the girl with pink hair once again. Since her friend couldn't be helped without direct intervention, she decides to play the enemy's game and go after the huge mosquito. The guy from the vampire class then celebrates because he finally managed to reach his goal. It soon becomes clear why the guy who was at least Class C was acting so arrogantly. After talking a bit about the enemy, the command for everyone to prepare for battle is given. As expected, it doesn't take long for the first attacks to begin. But suddenly, right at the start of everything, the monster notices something that catches his attention. Without giving the big guy time to think, a massive explosion occurs right above him with no chance to react. Out of nowhere, lightning had taken over the sky, and people watched everything without understanding the reason for it. Then the boy in the green jacket says that those are not natural phenomena, but rather someone who had shot at the monster with their powers. In any case, it doesn't take long for the author of the blow to appear, and it turns out to be the protagonist. After finishing the job, Sale feels a bit confused about something he had received from the teacher. She had given him a graduation gift for the excellent work done. The girl had kept that cloth for a long time, and Seal just needed to wait because he would see the effects when using it at the right time. After noticing that Lieber was a bit jealous of that gift, the protagonist offers her a chance to try using the amulet. The teacher quickly apologizes for not bringing a treat for the girl as well and even quotes a saying to avoid upsetting her. For her, it was wonderful because in recent days, Seal had become a very strong man, and just being near him was enough to feel it. After thinking these things, she comes to the conclusion that it would be the right time for him to go. She soon calls Seal with the intention of giving him another little gift. The boy feels a bit excited to know he would receive another treat for his effort. As he approaches the girl, the protagonist discovers that his gift was actually a kiss. On Sale's red skin, his shyness is evident. A few meters away, Callie watched everything without understanding absolutely anything. That slightly warmer farewell seemed to be his supposed last gift. Suddenly, the woman gives Seal a big shove that sends him flying far away. She had thrown him into the testing area, and he would need to return to bring Liber with him. While Seal shouted for help, the girl asked him to be careful while he was there. With that, a small flash appears in a previously unknown location. At that moment, he talks to the judges about a practice match before entering the test, along with the participants of that edition. After a few seconds in the air, Sale falls to the ground and soon realizes that he suffered no damage from the impact, probably due to the cloak he was wearing. In any case, he also notices that the ground in that place was very strange and out of the ordinary. But it doesn't take long for the protagonist to understand that he was actually on top of a person. Without hesitation, Sale gets off the guy, apologizing and showing a lot of concern. Then he panics upon realizing that the man was not responding, seeming to have died. Amid this chaos, out of nowhere, Seal hears a voice calling his name. It was the girl with pink hair trying to alert him about the danger he was in near that monster, which was no longer quiet like before. With that, Seal finally looks back and realizes the mess he got himself into, and it doesn't take long for the monster to strike, causing a huge destruction on the ground of the place. After that, the girl with pink hair is impressed by the strength of the opponent, who was delivering blows that were practically impossible to avoid. Looking more closely at the battlefield, she notices something that leaves her in shock. Seal was motionless in front of the enemy, who also wasn't moving for some reason. That monster was no longer patient, being completely immobilized by the protagonist's powers. At that moment, he really wanted to know who this simple, powerful boy was. When Seal looks back, he realizes that the huge group of people was watching him with all the attention in the world. One of them was carried and seemed quite injured after the monster's blow. These actions from the enemy make Seal even angrier and give him the strength to crush it. After exerting a lot of force, the monster rebels and charges at the protagonist, threatening him. Even with so much speed imposed in that first moment, Soul manages to stop the enemy with little effort just a few millimeters from his face. Without thinking twice, he simply calls out for his partner, Liber. With that, it doesn't take long for a huge flash to appear there, leaving those present quite scared. The girl with pink hair watched everything with a clear disbelief in her eyes. After the dust settled, Sale emerged with his weapon embedded in the back of the fallen monster. He soon mocks the enemy's sudden attack, saying that if it hadn't killed him, it probably wouldn't allow him to take the player test. That new Seal Jin was very different from what the girl knew, and surely something miraculous happened for this transformation to be possible in just 10 days. After annihilating the enemy, the protagonist finally looks down and decides to get down. In an unusual way, he ends up slipping and hitting his face on the ground, losing all his aura. He doesn't waste time in that embarrassing position and soon gets back up with a lot of effort. Feeling quite awkward, he blames those clothes that were supposedly too long. While the friends commented on that epic battle, Seal tried to clean up his image, saying that it didn't hurt at all. Suddenly, Callie arrives there quite angry, hitting the boy and making it clear that he was human. Amid so many scoldings, the girl reveals that she was scared because the protagonist had called her in the middle of that fight out of nowhere. Seeing that dramatic scene from afar, the girl with pink hair realizes that the duo hadn't changed that feisty characteristic. Then she leaves towards the two, leaving her friend speechless. Without wasting much time, he starts a little gossip in the midst of it. At that moment, the girl was arguing with the duo about their behavior, and Seal was trying to calm her down. All this excitement was because the exam was about to start, and she would go first. After this unnecessary scolding, Liber and Seal stare at the girl in shock, and it doesn't take long for her to head off to the player test, leaving everyone behind. With that, the gates finally begin to open, with the candidates waiting in front, quite anxious. The light coming from inside was incredible, and made the eyes of that group of dreamers shine. Sale quickly celebrates the start of the player test. Meanwhile, everything was calm in the beautiful castle. Suddenly, a lightning bolt appears at an absurd speed. Those lights weren't abilities of the disciples of that guy, so probably another rookie had that power. Hearing this, his employee suggests sending an investigation team, but this idea is quickly rejected by the leader. They couldn't miss that spectacle for anything, so the man decided to go there personally. After all, it had been a while since he faced the owner of the second place in the ranking. Once again, the scene returns to the gates opening. After that, the group of friends comes face to face with several other strange candidates. They were impressed to see up close the front door they had only heard about. Upon observing the place more closely, Seal has the feeling that all those people were staring at him strangely. But in the midst of the crowd, there was a guy who caught his attention. Seal's eyes widen as he realizes that Kim Tae-won was there. Finally, the examiner arrives, noticing that all the candidates were present, and decides to start a brief explanation about the test. Kim Tae-won was a rookie that the Avalon Guild was supporting with all its strength after a mere boy had killed all their attack units. At that moment, two representatives of this group were commenting on this new tool. But there was only one thing that the man in the white cloak was really sure of. That man was the only one who could influence him. Kim Tae-won seemed to be eagerly waiting for the start of the player test. Soon, one of the members of the Avalon Guild goes to inform him that the use of excessive force had been prohibited, and he responds that he was just going to greet his opponents. Unfortunately, it was already too late because Kim Tae-won was being authoritarian and ignorant even with those he didn't know. He rudely ordered some calm people to get out of his way. They just stared at him, startled for a few moments, and then quickly made way for Kim to pass. Finally, after so much unnecessary ignorance, the boy stands face to face with the protagonist. Callie becomes alert because she knew who that arrogant guy was. Seol then apologizes to his friend and informs her that he would only talk to the guy for a few moments. Without wasting much time, the protagonist takes a few steps forward, approaching the guy. Kim Tae-won quickly comments that his enemy had changed a lot and now knew how to look him in the eyes. Seol retorts, saying that this guy, on the other hand, was the same as always with childish and bad behavior. He becomes furious upon hearing this affront and without thinking twice, confronts the protagonist. In just a few moments, tensions rise, and the two almost start a fight that would be epic. This only didn't become a reality because the inspector arrived to put a stop to everything. In any case, she didn't care. But there were rules stating that fights were not allowed in the official testing area, and under her supervision, that wouldn't happen. Not wanting to cause trouble, those two stopped their nonsense without thinking twice. At the top of that hall, a guy watched everything attentively and seemed to be the leader of the Avalon Guild. With that, the inspector gives the two a glare before leaving while Seol received greetings from someone. That girl had witnessed everything when the protagonist had taken down a candidate with just one move. She seemed to like Seol and found him cute, but he wasn't her type of guy. This crazy girl even tested the protagonist's skin with pinches and commented on the approval of Group C with a perverted look. Finally, the inspector arrives to put a stop to Lulu and makes her say goodbye to the charming boy. Everyone had passed the test because of Seol, and that's why she commented that he needed to stop being so generous because it wasn't fair. Suddenly, a brute arrives there supporting Lulu with the argument that the protagonist's actions could become a problem for the balance of the test. The groups A and D that would take the same test had a smaller number compared to C, and allowing the participants to cooperate would make everything very unfair, argued Bibi. If Seol were really special, it would make that exam even more disproportionate, according to her. After listening to all these arguments, the inspector realizes that her boys have grown up and knows how to face these adversities. Meanwhile, Seol felt a different atmosphere in that place, and it seemed like the judges would start fighting at any moment. For a few moments, the inspector concentrates, even closing her eyes to think. Then she simply accepts that she has lost, allowing Lulu to do as she wishes, which makes her quite satisfied. Out of nowhere, the girl approaches Seol, commenting on cutting her clothing in half. Since she was sure that everyone had heard the conversations, she quickly informs that under her guidance, the tests for Group B would be conducted individually.
Our video ends here. If you liked it, leave your like. See you next time. Bye-bye.